"Step out of the car. Who the hell do you think you are?" the officer snarled, hand resting on his belt, ready to turn a black man into target practice. He thought he was about to teach a thug a lesson, but the man didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, just calmly said, "I'm the one investigating you." 1 second later, a badge from Internal Affairs flashed under the patrol lights, like a dagger straight into the cop's ego. The entire parking lot went dead silent. The officer's face turned pale, his lips trembled. "What state do you live in? If justice could show up with just one sentence, would you still believe it exists?" Night was falling as Elias drove along the endless strip of asphalt, a suburban highway stretched like an open palm line. Black rows of trees lined the roadside, their bare branches groping in the night wind. The pavement glistened under the faint yellow lights, forming a long trail beneath the wheels, reflecting like a chain of somber question marks. He kept the radio off, no music playing, only the sound of wind scraping the windows, mixing with the steady crunch of tires on the road. The silence brought no comfort. Instead, it carried a vague tension, like a thin film before a storm. His breathing slowed unconsciously. His thumb brushed the worn corner of the leather steering wheel. He still remembered buying this car, the salesman eagerly shaking his hand, saying this luxury model would make people respect him more. That advice, over the years, turned into a joke. In many places, no matter what he drove or wore, they looked at him the same way, as if the only thing that mattered was the skin he could not shed. A long stretch passed without another car overtaking. The night wind slid through the leaves, swept over the dark fields beyond. The air held the damp smell of grass mixed with the smoldering odor of fresh asphalt. Elias wondered how many times he had come home on roads like this, one hand resting lightly on the wheel, eyes on the darkness ahead, telling himself maybe this time would be uneventful. But tonight, something felt different. About 100 meters later, headlights switched on, casting a long beam across the pavement. A patrol car approached without sirens, cold white light sliding up the roof of his car and across the rear window. He glanced in the mirror. The car showed no intent to pass, just followed close behind like a pair of distant eyes. He pressed the gas pedal, then eased off, letting the speed slow on purpose. The narrow road seemed to close in. The trees looked less like trees and more like a shifting wall. Part of him wanted to pull over and wait for them to speak first. Another part said to let them reveal their real purpose. Elias never fully got used to being scrutinized, but he had learned how not to let it make his hands shake. The patrol car's rooftop lights suddenly flared, red and blue crossing in quick bursts, flashing on the pavement like an interrupted heartbeat. This time, he had no choice. He turned on the signal, guided the car slowly to the shoulder. The tires crunched on the gravel, each stone cracking sharply under the weight. He cut the engine, rested both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead. The night was still, only the patrol car's engine refused to die down, rumbling like a reminder it held control. Elias lowered the window, just a hand's width, enough for his voice to be heard but not his whole face seen. He did not want those headlights to search 1 inch of his skin more. The night air slipped through the gap, brushing his cheek with a cold that felt almost like fear. The patrol car door swung open. Hard boots struck the gravel in steady steps, drawing closer. Elias glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing a tall figure stop by the trunk of his car. For a moment, everything was silent, as if the man was weighing whether he had a reason to search the vehicle. Then the footsteps resumed, moving near the windshield. The officer's face appeared under the yellow and flashing red double lights. A pale face, a chin rough with fresh stubble. Narrow eyes slid through the gap in the window, lingering on Elias's forehead before dropping to the wallet and papers by the gearshift. "License and registration." His voice was hoarse, dull, not loud, but landing with an unsettling certainty. Elias kept his gaze steady. He had heard that sentence enough times to memorize every inflection. Sometimes it sounded like a reluctant routine, sometimes obvious suspicion. this time laced with a hint of undisguised disdain. "Why did you pull me over?" he asked, his voice low and even. In his mind, he counted his breaths to suppress the numb tingling at his neck. "Routine inspection." The 3 words came out slowly. The officer's thumb tapped the window glass in a steady rhythm. His stare never left Elias's face, as if waiting for the smallest sign of defiance. Elias opened the glove compartment, took out the wallet and the vehicle documents. His movements were neither fast nor hesitant. Every gesture was clear, so no one could claim he was hiding something. He handed them through the window. "You live nearby? I'm heading home." "Whose name is on this car?" "Mine." "What's your occupation?" Elias looked him straight in the eye. He felt no anger like in the past, only the cold acceptance of this endless ritual. "I am an investigator." "Investigate what?" "Internal affairs." The officer tilted his head slightly, his face relaxing as if he needed a moment to grasp it. Then his mouth curled into a thin smile. "Sounds fancy." He picked up the flashlight, scanning each paper again, reading every word and number slowly. In that moment, Elias felt he was being dissected into details, judged for any flaw. The wind outside grew harsher, pushing cold air through the window slit onto his neck. He slowly leaned deeper into the seat, one hand still on the wheel. The red foo light slid across half of the officer's face, throwing an unsteady shadow. That night, the road stayed empty, only the 2 of them and the space no one cared to fill. Elias let his gaze rest on the small badge pinned to the officer's shirt pocket, the cold silver reflecting the patrol lights into restless flickers. He had seen dozens of faces wearing badges like this, from the tired ones doing their duty to those who used it as a reason to crown themselves judges. The man standing by his window seemed to belong to the latter. The officer held the documents, his finger brushing the wallet's edge before pausing, as if debating whether to ask another unnecessary question. A glance swept over Elias's face, lowering briefly when it met the calm, unforced expression on his forehead, then stop on the insurance card. "You said internal investigation?" His voice held a trace of doubt, as if the term was too grand to come from someone behind the wheel of an old SUV, wearing a dark shirt instead of the shiny suits usually tied to important titles. Elias nodded, eyes fixed on the dark road. He had no reason to explain further, and he knew the man would not believe without checking for himself. The flashlight clicked on, its beam moving through the cabin, across the dashboard, the wheel, then up along Elias's jaw. That narrow light searched for something, a can tab, a stain, any trace to turn the stop into a pretext for a hassle. "You just bought this car." The flashlight lowered to the officer's waist, his tone light like casual talk. "I've used it for several years. The registration looks brand new, because I changed the registered address." Elias kept his voice even with no extra words. His eyes moved past the officer's shoulder, watching the red and blue lights spill over the empty pavement. Every sweep marked time he was held here for no reason. Moments others saw as trivial, but for him had become routine. The officer twisted the flashlight, tapping the wallet's flap lightly. His thumb drummed on the folder's edge again. Elias recognized that habit, a way to stretch silence, sowing that blend of tension and false patience that only those holding authority found comfortable. "Where do you live?" The question came after a pause. Elias felt it was not curiosity so much as a form of status check. "Near the city. Out 10 miles. The officer lifted his chin, his expression no more animated than before. That look had appeared in countless disciplinary files Elias had read in over a decade of his work, the same scrutiny mixed with the confidence that one careless word could drag the other down. "Who do you work with?" "The Internal Investigation Bureau." "Sounds pretty grand." Elias turned his head slightly, letting his gaze fall on the black line of trees across the road. He had expected this reaction, that mocking tone pressing each word, trying to peel his answer into empty bragging. The night wind cut through the narrow window opening, bitter cold. The air carried a faint burnt smell from the patrol car's engine, idling steadily, that fume reminding Elias that here he did not hold the initiative. The officer leaned in closer, his breath seeping through the gap, hot with stale coffee and cigarettes. "You know, people like to claim big titles," Elias said. Nothing. He kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes fixed ahead. From the mirror, the flashing light pulsed longer, washing over the officer's face, revealing tired, under-eye shadows and a half-smile of disdain. "Have you been stopped before?" "Yes." "How many times?" Elias pressed his lips, not answering right away. In his mind, a number unrolled, long and unending, each time starting with the same question, the same looks searching past his clothes and papers for the single reason they were after: plenty. The officer gave a short huff, lowering his eyes to the folder in his hand. A thick silence stretched between them until Elias felt his palm numb against the wheel. The man tilted his head slightly, watching Elias from under lowered lashes. "Are you afraid?" Elias raised his head, locking eyes with him slowly. In that instant, he felt no anger. The only thing running down his spine was a solid, steady fatigue, like armor he had worn for years. "How should I be?" His voice was not loud, but it touched a threshold that made the officer pause. Elias's engine kept a soft rumble, like a shallow breath after a long drive. He had learned not to let it drown out his voice. Another gust moved along the roadside, carrying damp earth and weeds. The officer stepped back half a pace, then bent to inspect the front of the license, his finger brushing the plastic edge as if searching for a meaningless scratch. "Anything in your car you need to declare?" "No." "You traveling alone?" "Yes." "You know, we have to be certain." "Certain of what?" "Certain." The man narrowed his eyes, chin lifting slightly, an expression flickering too fast to be hidden. Elias saw it at once. He had seen it in the interrogation room when an officer was called in to answer for misconduct, that moment when certainty collapsed into awkward emptiness. But tonight, the man did not let himself lose his footing. "Certain of my duty." "Duty or authority?" Elias's question came out calmly. "Duty." Between the clicking flashlight and the wind surrounding them, it sounded like a piece of metal hitting cold stone. A quiet breath crossed the narrow space between them. The officer straightened slowly, glancing over his shoulder at the patrol car. He might have been weighing whether to call backup or keep dragging out this inspection alone. Elias leaned back, eyes locked on the face under the red pupil lights. A thought passed through, tired and still, that one day these old questions would mean nothing but to show who was truly more afraid. Elias kept both hands on the wheel, his head tilted just enough to hear each breath of the man standing close by the window. The long silence spread from the moment the officer looked up from the papers, his pupils shifting as if he had noticed something worth holding on to. The red and blue lights on the patrol car kept flashing tirelessly, staining the road with blurred patches. For a brief instant, Elias thought he saw doubt showing behind the man's practiced confidence, but it vanished when the officer took a breath and returned to that dry, heavy tone. "You know, hardly anyone drives alone here this late." Elias looked into the dark ahead, the smell of asphalt lingering with the scent of earth lifted by the night wind. He had heard that question many times, in different voices, on nights like this when his presence on an empty street suddenly became something suspicious. Public road," Elias said softly, his voice showing neither challenge nor fatigue. "I have the right to use it like anyone else." The officer narrowed his eyes, lowering his brows. For a second, his face darkened under the sweep of the light. His finger tapped the window frame, each soft knock sharp in the air. "I'm not saying you don't have the right. I'm talking about habit." "Whose habit?" The question came without planning, natural as breathing, a reflex after years of hearing other people press their standards onto his life. The officer stopped tapping, his gaze locking on Elias with a flicker of hesitation. "The habit of ordinary people." Elias turned fully to face him, the patrol light drawing a sharp edge along his cheekbone. No one spoke. The car engine behind them kept its steady hum, the old soundtrack of encounters made to show who held authority. "What are you looking for?" Elias asked, his voice no louder than before. "I'm looking for a reason to be sure," the officer said, his breath cold and smelling of bitter coffee. "That's my job." His eyes drifted over Elias's collar, paused at his shoulder, then slid along the arm resting lightly on the wheel. That gesture was not to confirm any fact, but a quiet test to see whether the man before him would yield under inspection. Elias looked down the road to the lone yellow light shining from a distant house. He thought of the last time his father had been stopped, also on a deserted street, also by a face much like this one. That memory stayed like a cut in his palm, never letting him forget that some things do not disappear. They only change form to last longer. How long do you plan to keep this up? The question fell into the silence without any quick answer. The officer slipped the flashlight into his pocket, his fingers still tapping the same rhythm. His narrow eyes rose to study Elias again until I feel satisfied. Satisfied about what? That you're not hiding anything. Elias leaned deeper into his seat, his breath leaving a thin cloud through the cracked window. A part of him was ready for the next justification, but most of him did not care to guess. He knew too well that every question was just filling the gap they were afraid to face, the calm of the person they thought must be guilty. "You want to search the car?" "Not yet," the officer said, his voice drifting. "I don't see any clear cause." His gaze kept scanning Elias's face as if he hoped to catch a twitch or crack, but Elias's expression stayed even. That quiet was not to intimidate or to plead. It simply existed, needing no explanation. The officer looked down at the papers again. His finger paused on the name, brushed across Elias Carter, then slid to the field for occupation. His brow smoothed briefly, then pulled tight again, as if he feared showing too much. "Do you have proof you work in internal affairs?" "I don't have to prove that to you." Elias's voice stayed the same. Cold air still came through the gap, making his skin slowly numb. Inside the car, there was no sound except the steady beat of his heart, louder to him than anything. The man took a slow breath, his hand closing around the edge of the wallet. The red and blue light washed over his face, turning it pale with streaks of greenish and pinkish tones Elias had memorized from so many nights. "Your papers are valid," the officer said slowly, "but I'm still not certain." "Then what will you do?" "I'll keep asking." Elias looked away, his gaze resting on the gear shift, then sweeping the familiar cabin, the smell of leather and old paper, the closed compartment holding files. Nothing here held any fear, except the thought that it could all be torn apart at any moment. "What else do you want to ask? Any criminal record?" "No." "Any weapons?" "No." "Ever fined?" "Yes." "For what?" "Speeding, 8 years ago." The answer came calmly, no emphasis, no excuse. The officer paused, his eyes sliding across Elias's face, looking for anything to accuse. "Are you afraid I won't believe you?" "I don't care what you believe." For the first time that night, Elias let his voice fall lower, not from exhaustion, but because the question deserved nothing more. The man looked away, his hand letting go of the papers. The space between them did not shrink or widen, only stretched into more of that tense silence. In that moment, Elias knew this man was not ready to end it. He was deciding on the next move in a pointless chess match. The night wind still turned around them, lifting the smell of dry dust and weeds. The road behind the patrol car began to glow faintly, maybe from the headlights of another vehicle. Elias did not look back. He kept his eyes forward, listening to the hard shoes shifting on gravel, waiting to see how many more questions he would have to answer before they realized his face held nothing to judge but this quiet. At that moment, Elias noticed the officer's hand tightening around the flashlight, an unconscious gesture when someone prepares to do something important. The red and blue lights on the patrol car's roof kept sweeping across his face in cold, broken layers. Night wind slipped along the road, carrying dry dust and a trace of unburned gasoline. The officer lowered his head slightly, aiming the beam at the edge of the window, the narrow light sliding through the gap and pointing straight at Elias's chest. He did not move, staring into the narrowed eye opposite him. The cold beam drifted over his arm, wrist, and stopped on the shirt pocket, illuminating every crease. "You are not carrying anything, are you?" I already answered. "I want to confirm." Elias swallowed a breath, letting it sink to his stomach. That face stayed blank, but the voice carried a layer of impatience, as if he was annoyed Elias's silence would not turn into fear. "I am not carrying any weapons." The flashlight slid aside, sweeping the floor, passing under the driver's seat, and returning to Elias's face. In that light, the officer's eyes were clear, the whites dull yellow, the eyelids tired, but deeper was a crude curiosity hidden under feigned calm. "Will you allow me to search the car?" Elias slowly leaned back. A gust struck the window, making the edge of the papers in the officer's hand flutter. He knew this question was not about procedure, but the next step in a drawn-out, probing game. The reason? Just procedure. Procedure must have grounds. The officer raised one eyebrow, the flashlight angling up Elias's jaw. He pressed his lips together, tapping the flashlight with a finger. The empty road behind stretched in darkness, the patrol car's light casting his shadow long like a gash. "I find your defensiveness unusual." Defensiveness at being stopped without cause is not unusual. He exhaled sharply through his nose, the beam drifting again along the doorframe. His voice dropped, hoarse and edged with frustration. "Do you have a problem? If I search, I have the right to refuse." Elias felt his pulse slow. The quiet in the car was not comforting, but proof that he faced someone willing to drag this standoff to absurd lengths to claim a win. The officer straightened, switching off the flashlight. In that instant of darkness, Elias noticed the man's shoulders slump a little. Maybe understanding Elias's composure was not an act. The flashlight snapped back on, this time aimed directly at his face. "I am asking you to step out of the car. Based on what? I need to check. Do you have a warrant? I do not need a warrant in this situation." The officer's voice turned dry, stripped of false calm. Lines deepened at the corners of his eyes, his breath short and heavy. Elias met the glare without flinching. He had waited for this line, the last step when the questioner had no argument left to stretch out his power display. "You want me out?" "Yes." Elias nodded slightly, hand on the seatbelt latch. The flashlight dropped to the floor, the officer stepping back half a pace, shoulders tensing with caution. As Elias opened the door, the night air flooded his chest, sharp with grass and asphalt. He stepped out slowly, the big black car behind him now a silent witness. The officer shifted his feet, beam trailing along the car's side. His eyes stayed fixed on Elias's shoulder. "Stay where you are." Elias stopped beside the open door. The wind whipped past his collar. He felt the pulse under his collarbone steady, but kept his voice low and even. "I am not moving." The flashlight swept from his calf to his hip, across the interior and back to his face. The distance was close enough that he felt the man's breath against his ear. The officer leaned in, voice dropping further. "How long do you plan to act calm?" "Until you follow the law." A brief silence, then the hand on the flashlight clenched tighter. The officer tilted his head, the beam cutting across Elias's eyes. In that moment, Elias saw the flicker of unease there, unease masked by an authoritative stance and condescending tone, but unable to hide the fatigue of someone sinking into a pointless search. "Have you ever reacted this way when stopped before?" "This way?" "Like you have nothing to do with it." "Because I do not." His breathing grew heavier. The flashlight swept the driver's seat again. A second of hesitation, then he lowered his voice. "You should understand we have the right to search, if necessary." "I understand, but that right has limits." A strong gust hit his shoulder, rustling the papers in the officer's grip. Elias stared straight ahead, the red and blue glare washing over his chin before fading. The night stayed dense on the road, the patrol car idling, waiting for the end of this prolonged questioning. The officer stepped back half a pace, eyes locked on Elias's face. He drew a breath, his hand trembling as he shone the light one last time around the front seat to be sure nothing was hidden. Then he stopped, turning the flashlight off. "You can sit back inside, but do not move." Elias nodded once, silent. He returned to the driver's seat, pulling the door closed. The cold outside faded after the latch clicked. The flashlight rested on the hood, its last beam crossing the windshield before dying out. In the leftover darkness, Elias leaned into the seat, letting his face fall into the pale glow from the dashboard. He did not feel anger. What he felt was an old exhaustion, like smoke lingering after a fire he once believed he had forgotten. Elias sat still in the car, his back pressed into the seat, eyes watching through the window, a short gap. The night air cooled the cabin into a damp chill, creeping to his scalp. He saw the officer turn away, the flashlight now switched off, his shoulders pulling in as if he needed to steady himself. The patrol car stood hulking behind, red and blue lights sweeping the pavement in steady pulses, the quiet so deep the idling engine sounded like a beating heart. Elias rested his head against the cushion and let out a slow breath. In front of him, the display screen glowed soft green, its numbers frozen into something meaningless. He had often thought, on roads like this, that time was no longer measured by minutes. It was measured by the number of questions, the times the flashlight crossed his face, and the breaths that grew shorter after each round of suspicion. Another beam of light flared at the end of the road. Elias tilted his head, seeing headlights from another car approaching. The darkness between the vehicles shrank, bright yellow beams stretching long shadows across the pavement. A white sedan crept past, the driver curious about what was happening. The officer stepped back toward Elias's trunk, standing half-brocked in front of the patrol lights. He folded his arms, not turning to look at the new car, though his eyes narrowed. The sedan stopped a few meters away, the side window sliding down. A man leaned out, his voice breaking the hush. "Is there a problem? You keep driving," the officer said without looking at him. His tone clipped enough to make the man hesitate. Elias saw the driver's eyes, wary and uncertain. A few seconds later, the sedan moved again, headlights gliding over the asphalt, stretching Elias's shadow in a warped shape on the patrol car. He knew more people would stop. This road had few houses, but it was the shortcut between two towns, and sometimes cars passed through, especially when the night sagged before curfew. Elias glanced at his watch just to confirm he had not sat here too long, then lifted his eyes to the empty road. Tires crackled over gravel. An old hatchback came from the opposite direction, slowing when it saw the flashing lights. It stopped a few meters off, headlights shining full on the two figures. A woman's voice rose, softer but tinged with curiosity. "Do you need help?" "No," the officer answered quickly, his voice short and dry. "Keep moving." The woman looked at Elias, meeting the small nod he gave her, then turned to the officer. Her hand tightened on the wheel, pausing a moment before the car rolled away. In that moment, Elias sensed something different in her gaze. It was not exactly pity nor sympathy, only recognition, simple and clear, knowing who stood where. When the hatchback disappeared, darkness returned. The patrol lights swept again, casting a cold glow over the hood, over Elias's shoulder. The officer still stood with his arms folded, but his back had bent slightly, as if to shield himself from the looks of strangers who had just passed by. Elias loosened his grip on the wheel, slowly rotated his neck. He heard the faint crack of joints, fatigue spreading from his nape down to his shoulder. The smell of dust inside the car mixed with the cold metallic scent of the door handle. Outside, the road settled back into stillness, only the signal light blinking without pause. This time, Elias looked at the officer longer. The man's face tilted down, his eyes lowered. Elias felt he was watching someone wrestling himself, torn between keeping up this pointless inspection and the worry that tonight was no longer private between them. Another set of headlights bloomed. A dark green pickup truck came from a bend, rolling forward at a slow crawl. It stopped right beside Elias. The driver's window slid down to reveal an older man's face, voice raspy from too many years of smoking. "Need any help, buddy?" The officer shifted his shoulders, eyes flicking briefly to Elias before answering. "Please, keep moving." The man in the truck didn't leave right away. His gaze fixed on Elias, then moved over the patrol lights. The uniform. The night breeze snapped across them, making the brim of his cap tremble. "What's he done?" "I'm telling you to move along," the officer repeated, voice lower. The pickup driver gave a quiet grunt, not replying at once. His eyes slowly returned to Elias's face, then dipped in a short nod, as if confirming something. Only when the officer drew his shoulders higher did he finally start the engine and roll the truck away. The engine faded, leaving the silence between them. Elias looked at the officer. The man's hands had dropped to his sides, no longer folded across his chest. A weariness settled around his eyes, slow and plain in the dull light. Elise said nothing. The presence of those who stopped had changed the air completely. It pulled the inspection out of secrecy and turned it into a public scene where anyone could stop, ask questions, or simply watch. And Elise knew that for those who wore authority like armor, the eyes of strangers were sharper than any accusation. The patrol car radio crackled suddenly. A voice mixed with static announced another patrol car circling near the area. The officer reached for the microphone, replying in a low tone that Elias could not catch. But he saw the hesitation in the man's hand as it trembled, the way his lips pressed to a thin line. A strong wind swept past, making the branches along the road whisper like quiet voices. Elias adjusted his seatbelt, the movement slow, his breathing measured. Every stray detail of this night etched itself deeper than any official interrogation he had ever sat through. The crunch of gravel, the tired flash of lights, the cold seeping through the crack in the window, the officer's face slowly losing certainty. He wondered if the man understood that the more witnesses gathered, the harder it would be to turn away from what he did not want to admit. This inspection had no rightful cause. It existed only to stretch injustice into something that looked ordinary. When the pickup's taillights vanished behind the curve, the road went quiet again. Elias lowered his eyes to his hands, the skin on his knuckles smoothed under the dim glow, every crease showing clearly, a reminder that no matter how this night ended, it would leave another mark he would carry. The officer remained where he was, staring at the pavement. The distance between them was not large, but Elias felt it had changed. In the dim light, he saw for the first time the edge of caution begin to show behind the rigid mask, and he believed the crowd that had passed by had looked, had understood, even if they had not stayed long. The night wind began to ease, leaving a silence like a tense buffer that might snap at any moment. The patrol lights swept the road in dull streaks, illuminating the officer's face as he stepped closer to Elias. That gesture had lost its initial casualness, hinting at a discreet unease, as if he too realized the inspection had gone on far longer than necessary. Elias stayed still, both hands on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the man, tracking each small motion, each flicker in his stare. Part of him wanted to believe the passing cars had made the man reconsider, but deeper, he knew this was the moment contempt would surface most easily, when pride started to crack under the witness of others. The officer lifted his head to look straight at Elias, his voice dropping, laced with stale coffee and cigarette breath. "You think you are better than me?" Elias did not reply, his lips pressed into a flat line, gaze level, refusing to look away. A wrinkle flickered across the officer's forehead as he narrowed his eyes, trying to read what thoughts were passing through. "You think sitting there like that is supposed to scare me?" Elias let out a slow breath, the sound fading in the cabin. He had waited for that question, not because it mattered, but because it showed the man had lost the confidence to pretend neutrality. "I am not here to scare you," Elias answered, voice steady, no louder than needed. "I am here because you asked me to stay." The officer's eyes dropped to Elias's hands, then to the papers on the hood. After a short pause, he shifted his shoulders, as if adjusting his composure, then lowered his voice further. "I have seen plenty who think they are special just because they drive a nice car, wear a pressed shirt. They think that means the law cannot touch them. Which law are you applying here?" The question left Elias's mouth lightly, like a comment, but it made the man's expression twitch, his lips tightening, fingers stiff on the flashlight. "I am following procedure," the officer rasped. "I have the right to hold you until I am sure you are not hiding anything." "Are you sure you are doing this properly?" "You do not have the right to ask me that." "Then on what authority are you asking me all these questions?" Elias spoke in a low tone without anger. It was only the same old fatigue, mixed with the knowledge he was repeating a familiar refrain, where his role was always examined as if it were just a disguise. The officer shook his head slightly, eyes shifting from Elias's face to the darkness behind him. The patrol beam moved across stained asphalt, casting their shadows into two warped shapes, almost merging into one. "You know," he said, emphasizing each word, "if you do not cooperate, I can call for backup." Elias did not move. For a brief moment, he saw frustration and doubt ignite together in the officer's eyes. The man was trying to read his face, to find some crack to cling to. "I am not stopping you from doing your job." Elias said. "You asked, and I complied. You still have not told me why you are here at this hour. I am going home. Where is home? You already asked that, and I am asking again." His voice rose, no longer slow or confident, carrying a thin note of anger, like the last thread holding his calm in place. "Near the city?" Elias said. "Do you need the exact address? I need you to admit you are hanging around here without a clear reason. I have done nothing against the law." The officer's grip tightened on the flashlight. A second passed, then he leaned closer, voice falling to a contemptuous whisper. "You think I do not see how you have been looking at me? Like someone who believes papers in his hand are enough to make everyone else look stupid?" Elias raised his eyes, meeting the weary, clouded gaze directly. In that moment, neither spoke. The patrol radio crackled, then fell silent. A light breeze ruffled the hair on the officer's forehead. "I have no reason to think you are a fool," Elias said, his voice neither rising nor softening, "but you are doing everything to make yourself look that way." A flash of red flared behind the man's eyes, then vanished into a quiet, unreadable look. His fingers let go of the flashlight's edge, drifting to the window frame. "Have you ever been questioned this thoroughly before?" "Many times, and you are still not used to it." "I do not have to get used to it." A slow silence settled, like a drop of dew sliding down the door edge. Elias felt his heart beat in short pulses. The darkness still wrapped the road, making everything uncertain, but in that instant nothing felt unclear. Every question had revealed its true purpose. The officer stepped back half a pace, his face relaxed into something dull, hard to tell if it was tiredness or shame. The flashlight switched off, leaving a shadow across half his cheek. "I will call more units. You think you need to? I need to be sure you are not lying." Elias looked steadily at him, voice calm. "I have not lied about anything. I will confirm that myself." He turned away, his boots grinding the dry gravel in a harsh scrape. Elias rested his head on the seat, watching the patrol lights flicker over the road. A cold bead of sweat slid from his temple to his jaw. He drew a long breath, his chest filling with the cold night air. It was always the same, harmless questions, dropped one by one, revealing the real intent, to force his existence into something he had to justify. The patrol radio crackled softly again, the dispatcher's voice distant and flat. The officer bent to the microphone, murmuring a few words Elias could not make out. Then he turned back, fixing his stare on Elias. In the red and blue glow, his eyes darkened with something that mixed anger and worry. "Stay put. Do not think about leaving." Elias did not reply. As the officer walked back to his car, a line deepened across his forehead. It was not the line of someone sure he was in control, but the trace of a man starting to doubt the very interrogation he was clinging to. The radio in the patrol car kept crackling, growing louder against the long silence. Elias sat still, hands resting on his thighs, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, where the red and blue lights spread over the rough asphalt. That light didn't just cut through the blackness. It showed the thin line between a so-called routine check and a patient show of force. He heard the officer's voice over the radio, steady and low, but pausing at the end of each sentence, as if even he wasn't sure what he meant to emphasize. Filtered through the glass, the halting words sounded more like asking permission from some unseen figure than reporting to a colleague. Then everything fell quiet for a long moment. The night wind swept past the bare roadside trees, slipped through the cracked window and sent a thin chill down Elias's neck. He didn't shiver or sneeze, just let the cold seep deep into his chest, the way a truth spread slowly through the bones, impossible to push away. A second patrol car came from the opposite direction. Its headlights swept the road, casting the shadow of Elias's SUV in a long, warped shape that reached the edge of the woods. The vehicle stopped slowly, the engine growled once, then went silent. A door opened and the cabin light flared before disappearing into the darkness. A younger officer stepped out, his uniform jacket puffed up in the cold wind, his stance showing the presence meant to add weight to the question. He didn't speak at once, just stood behind his colleague, glanced briefly at Elias, then at the file on the hood. Elias recognized that look, measuring, not fully confident, yet sure enough that numbers would tip everything. everything their way. The first officer turned, his voice deeper than before. "This is Officer Wilkins, my partner." Elias didn't reply. His gaze stayed level, locked on the newcomer. The way Wilkins shifted his weight onto his right leg, hand resting on his belt, showed clear caution. "Officer Wilkins will help me conduct a more thorough search. We need to be sure you aren't carrying anything illegal." Elias heard that and felt no surge of anger. Every declaration so far had drifted into the same place, making him prove his innocence in a situation that had little to do with the law itself. The young officer rolled his shoulders, glanced at his partner, then spoke in a hoarse voice that betrayed he'd just finished a long patrol shift. "Do you have any problem if I look inside the vehicle?" "Yes." Elias's answer came out so calmly that both men paused for half a second. "I have the right to refuse without a valid reason." A moment of silence filled the space between them. The first officer tilted his head slightly, brows lowered. Wilkins shifted on his feet, his hand hovering near the grip of his gun. "You are obstructing an officer," the older man said, his voice thin through clenched teeth. "I haven't obstructed anything," Elias replied. "I've provided my documents, I've answered your questions. I'm sitting here because you asked me to." Wilkins looked at his colleague, nodded a little as if silently asking something, but stayed quiet. They stood close, watching Elias's face. In the heavy darkness, he could see how suspicion kept wrapping around them like mud that wouldn't wash off. A gust swept down the roadside, tossing dry leaves against the tire. The patrol lights pulsed in slow flashes, painting Wilkins's shoulders. He pressed his lips together and stepped half a pace forward. "Where are you coming from?" Elias turned his head, voice steady. "I've already told you. We need to hear it again." "I'm on my way home." Wilkins bit his lip. His eyes dropped to Elias's collar, then lifted to meet his gaze again. For a second, he might have realized this wasn't someone easily broken by repeated questions. But habit taught him to stretch the questioning until the other side wore themselves down. The older officer stepped up beside his partner, voice flat, like a reminder. "You don't see that your attitude is becoming less cooperative?" "You call it uncooperative," Elias said, "but you still haven't told me what I violated." Another gust slipped through the window crack, chilling his hand. He tightened his fingers, holding back any unnecessary words. In his mind, other searches replayed like black and white images, memories he never chose to revisit. Wilkins lowered his head slightly, eyes sliding past Elias into the car. That look didn't carry the spite of the first officer, but a practical suspicion, hunting for any small reason to summon more backup. "What's in the trunk?" "Tool bag. Spare gear. Any weapons?" "No." Wilkins glanced at his partner. The first officer clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, Elias saw the irritation fracture the professional mask. "You understand we have to be thorough." "I understand," Elias said, voice low and steady, "but understanding doesn't mean agreement." Wilkins swallowed, looking down. A taut second passed. Then the older officer lifted his chin and said what Elias had expected. "We will search the vehicle, and if necessary, we will conduct a full search. Do you have a warrant?" "We have the right in cases of reasonable suspicion." "Then you will need to prove that reason." For the first time since this started, Elias's voice dropped, but it didn't waver. It cut through the dim air like a reminder that he wasn't here to surrender. Wilkins shifted his weight again. The night wind twisted over the road, lifting the hem of his jacket. The red and blue lights flashed across the older officer's face, outlining his tightly pressed mouth. Elias leaned back, never breaking eye contact. In the quiet rush of blood in his temples, he felt the steady resolve he no longer cared to restrain. The questioning might drag on, but it would not make him bow his head. The wind had stopped hitting the window, leaving behind a strange hush. Inside the car, Elias stayed in the same position, one hand resting on the wheel, eyes fixed on the darkness slowly dissolving under the patrol lights. The older officer quietly leaned in, his elbow propped on the edge of the window, so close his breath left a faint, bitter smell of stale smoke in the space between them. "Are you hiding anything in the car?" The voice dropped like a small stone onto still water, sending invisible ripples out. It no longer pretended to be curious, it was a statement. The pale yellow light from the patrol car cut across half his face, showing the furrow between his brows and a faint crease on his forehead. Elias did not answer. He held the officer's narrow stare, letting the blue-red flashes glint in the other man's eyes. The silence thickened, second by second. Not the silence of surrender, but a curtain blocking every idle question. Wilkins stood behind, his gaze shifting between them, then lowering to the papers on the hood. He shifted his shoulders, his shoes crunching lightly on the gravel. No one spoke. "Do you hear me?" The next question rose a little sharper, still full of confidence that an answer would come, as it always did from the inspector. Elias stayed quiet. He looked at the officer, letting the patrol light wash over his face, casting a dim shadow across the man's pupil. A short pause followed. Then the flashlight tapped a slow beat on the window ledge. Wilkins eased back half a step, his eyes turning away. Elias saw the tension in the officer's expression, that strain when someone realized silence could be the one reply that made everything slip out of control. A headlight flared in the distance, rolling toward them. Elias did not turn, but he heard the engine pacing over the uneven road. The officer tilted his head, tracking the new light, separating from the darkness. "You think not answering is smart?" Elias kept his breathing steady, the pulse beneath his wrist tapping lightly, but his hand stayed fixed on the wheel. His gaze held nothing challenging, nothing apologetic, only the calm of a man who would not waste more words on a conversation that had turned into a hollow interrogation. "You know you're making this harder for yourself?" Wilkins shifted his stance, head tipping slightly, an uncertain look passing over his face. Elias stayed where he was, back against the seat, eyes level, so he never had to look down. He heard a pebble slip from someone's shoe onto the road's edge, a sound so soft it almost disappeared. A coarse laugh split the quiet like a thin blade across still water. The officer leaned closer, his mouth curling into a thin smirk. Too scared to talk? The words were never meant to find truth. They were dropped into the silence like cheap bait. Elias looked straight through them, neither flinching nor looking away. The officer stepped back half a pace as if testing for a reaction. In the shifting patrol light, Elias saw the man's eyes narrow to slits, a crease digging deep between his brows. Wilkins's gaze slid down to Elias's hand. The beam of the flashlight brushed over his fingers, curling tighter. The pulse beneath the dark skin rose in slow beats. That hand stayed still, only the knuckles whitening as his grip clenched. The officer's breath drifted through the crack in the window, carrying the sour trace of old coffee before it faded. He said nothing else, but the crooked line of his mouth lingered an instant before vanishing when Elias refused to look away. A few meters off, the second patrol car killed its headlights, leaving only the red and blue strobes pulsing. Wilkins wetted his lips, as if to speak, then stopped. For a moment, Elias felt the cold, earth-scented air cling to his neck like an unpleasant aftertaste. The officer dropped his hand from the window frame, stretched his fingers, then raised the flashlight to eye level. The beam focused in a narrow cone across the bridge of Elias's nose, splitting his face into light and dark. In that brightness, Elias's pupils tightened, but he did not squint. "I'll ask you again, are you hiding anything in the car?" This time the voice trembled slightly, anger mixed with uncertainty. Elias let the light pass over him, his breathing even. Silence stacked itself in thin layers, growing thicker every second. His hand clenched harder around the wheel, thumbnail pressing down until the skin whitened. No reply had any worth left, only the resolve to spend no more breath on a search that had long since outrun any legitimate purpose. Wilkins lowered his eyes, glancing over Elias's wrist before turning away. For a second, the younger man's face showed hesitation, as if he too felt it was no simple thing to stand beside such unshakable quiet. The older officer turned his body, flashlight dipping to sweep across the pedal, the file box, before it went dark. The patrol car's radio crackled once, then fell silent. Elias lifted his eyes from them to the slow blinking bar of lights on the roof. Each time the blue flashed, it caught his chin, his expression unchanged. In the dim space pressing in around all four of them, silence had become a wall stronger than any defense. The patrol car radio crackled briefly, a voice echoing from afar, tangled with shrill static before cutting off. Elias stayed seated, head tilted slightly, eyes fixed through the gap in the window to watch the older officer outside. The man braced an arm on the doorframe, his breath carrying sour coffee and old tobacco. For a moment the silence thickened between them. Then, broke with a cold laugh, sharp as wind whipping across the road. You know what kind I hate most? His voice had lost any trace of duty, every word dragged out, heavy enough to press on the chest of whoever heard it. Elias kept his gaze steady, locked on the lowered face, the dull black pupils glinting under the patrol lights like a smear of oil. Wilkins stood off to the side, hands shoved into his coat pockets, chin down, as if he wished to leave but was held there by some invisible thread. "The kind that sits there," the officer hissed, mouth shut, looking at me like I owe you something. Elias did not move an inch. His hand on the wheel shifted slightly, thumb tracing the frayed stitching. He had heard words like these before, but never from a voice so clogged with personal hatred. "You think that made-up title of yours scares me?" The man's breath blew through the window gap, rank and suffocating. Elias looked past his shoulder, down the road behind them, black as ink with no end in sight. "I have stopped countless black men driving around at night," the officer said, stressing each syllable, "and none of them could fake innocence as well as you." Wilkins swallowed, face uneasy, but said nothing. A strong gust scattered grit over Elias's shoes. He did not look down, his stare locked on the face leaning into the glass. "You sit there, pretending to be dignified. That condescending tone, the way you look at me, like I am garbage." The man let out a short laugh that stank of anger. "You are not special. You are just another black thief playing the model citizen." Elias's chest tightened. "Ah!" A long breath slipped from his throat without any reply. In his mind, he saw his father's thin face leaning across the wheel one night, waiting to be judged by someone who believed power gave them the right to humiliate anyone. Wilkins stepped back, no longer meeting Elias's gaze. The officer stayed close, back straight, chin lifted, eyes streaked with rage. "You think I cannot see that look?" His voice dropped to a growl, the look of some smug bastard who thinks flashing a badge makes the whole world bow down. Elias turned his head, meeting his eyes, not with shouting, but with the hardness of stone. "You are sure you understand me?" Elias asked, voice low and cold. "Understand? I have seen hundreds like you," the officer said, tilting his head, mouth stretching into a brazen smile. "You are not special. You are just good at playing victim, good at waving your skin around like a shield." A sweep of patrol lights slid over them, a red flash carving the anger on his face into something raw. Wilkins lifted a hand, about to touch his colleague's shoulder, then let it fall. Elias drew a slow breath, feeling every cell in his chest rise and sink. In his eyes, the man's face came into focus so clearly he could see every crease at the corners of his eyes, every glint of darkness between the furrowed brows. "You think you are better than me?" The officer spat each word through clenched teeth. "You think just because you dress decent, drive decent, I will believe you are not a fraud?" Elias said nothing. His hand left the wheel, resting on his thigh, fingers curling into a fist and releasing again. Another gust flipped the edge of the papers on the hood. The cold dust mixed with the stinging smell of anger. "You know what I see when I look at you?" His voice dropped to a final, cutting murmur. "A black man trying to look clean, stuffing fake pride in my face." Wilkins turned away. Behind them, the night thickened, the deserted road empty of any sign a car had ever passed. Elias held the stare without flinching. "I will remember your face," the officer said, voice dragging out in a low threat. "Next time, you will not be this lucky." Elias tipped his head slightly, voice so quiet the wind almost swallowed it. "You go ahead." In that instant, blue light flashed again, washing his jaw in a sickly glow. The officer's shoulders twitched, as if he was not sure he had spoken the last word. Wilkins shifted, stepping back fully with a thin sigh. The wind tangled the sweat-damp hair across Elias's forehead. He did not look down, did not glance aside, his eyes fixed on the man who had spent nearly an hour trying to prove he was beneath him. "You think you win because you stayed silent?" the officer demanded, voice cracking into a rapid beat. "You think you win something here? Some worthless show of pride?" Elias pressed his lips together, shaking his head once. "I do not need to beat you." "Right, because you never were on equal ground. the man rasped, exhausted. All you can do is hide behind that badge and hope someone respects you. And you, Elias whispered, hide behind that uniform to believe you are strong. A ragged breath burst out, then quieted as if some thread had snapped. The officer stepped back half a pace, shoulders lowering, his stare still fixed on Elias, but inside, the anger had turned into something else, half doubt, half bitterness. Wilkins moved forward a little, voice soft as if to soothe. Let me talk to him, all right? The officer did not answer, only raised a hand to stop him, eyes never leaving Elias. For a moment, the night wind blew through, making everything go still, the radio crackling like falling pins. Elias drew a deep breath, chest expanding, then sinking slowly. He did not remember how many questions he had been asked, how many looks he had endured. He only knew with each breath he understood one thing more. Silence did not make him small. It made the other man see himself more clearly. The air around them went completely still after the last words. The older officer looked away from Elias, his shoulders sinking as if he had just lost part of the tension he had forced up to stay in control. The black night swallowed the road and every stray sound that had lingered, leaving only the steady pulse of the patrol lights, reminding everyone this standoff was not truly over. Elias stared straight through the windshield, each breath drawing out in short intervals. Every time he inhaled, the cold air filled his chest, making the pulse under his wrist slow to a steady beat. Inside the car, darkness lay over the dashboard, and the edge of the leather wallet resting by the gearshift. Wilkins glanced at his colleague, an uneasy mix of confusion and caution in his eyes. He stepped forward, voice hoarse like someone who had run out of breath. "We will call for support to verify your information." Elias stayed still, hand resting lightly on the wheel. His gaze held no mockery, no plea, only the flat reflection of every struggle flickering in the other man's eyes. "Call whoever you need," Elias said, his voice low. "I will be here." Wilkins hesitated briefly, then gave a short nod as if trying to cover the awkwardness he could no longer hold back. He turned away, spoke a few words into the radio. The reply came through in a burst of static, broken by crackling noise. The older officer remained silent, his face turned toward the empty road. A moment later, he lowered his hand from the window edge and stepped back a few paces, his shoes crunching dryly on the gravel. In that instant, Elias noticed the sweat clinging to the back of the man's shirt in a dark patch. Cold drifted in through the cracked window. Elias leaned deeper into the seat, his hand leaving the wheel to rest on his thigh. His eyes watched the patrol lights blinking across the glass. In that flickering glow, a memory surfaced like water stirred by a small stone. His father's hand once pulling out a polished black card, voice ragged with held-back anger. "Sometimes people only stop when they see the sign they fear the most." Elias closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them, his hand brushing the edge of the wallet on the tray. The motion held no show of force. He had waited for this exact moment, when the insults no longer had anywhere to land, when every word left would expose their real purpose. Wilkins turned to look at him, the dim yellow light from the patrol car ceiling sweeping across his face and laying a long shadow over his nose. His voice stumbled slightly. "Do you have anything to say before the other team arrives?" Elias did not answer immediately. He lifted the wallet, set it in his palm so the smooth black leather caught the dull glow. The smell of old paper and tanned hide rose for a second, taking him back to the early days of holding that card, when he still believed it was enough to make people respect boundaries. "I only want to remind you," Elias said, his eyes steady, "I know the law better than you think." Wilkins swallowed hard, his gaze wavering. The older officer drew in his shoulders, his face slackening, though he tried to keep a shred of composure. The patrol light slid over the badge. The words "Internal Affairs Division Chief" stood out sharply, each letter cut into the tense silence stretching between the three of them. The older officer blinked once, then again, his pupils locked on the text, dilating, as if he had just seen something he never believed would appear in the hand of the man he had called an imposter. In that moment, the quiet grew so deep, Elias could hear the wind scrape along the window. Wilkins stepped back half a pace, his mouth opening and closing, a dry swallow breaking the stillness. The older man froze, his face blanched, as if someone had ripped away the last mask hiding his borrowed confidence. A sudden gust swept the road, sending dry branches skittering across Elias's tires. That rustling sounded like a brutal confirmation that, from now on, everything had changed. Every advantage of this long inspection was no longer in uniformed hands. Wilkins blinked over and over, his chest rising and falling in tight, nervous waves. He looked at his partner as if begging for reassurance, but the other man stayed still, eyes locked on the badge. Is this real? Wilkins stammered, his voice rasping like it had been torn out of his throat. Elias did not have to answer. His hand stayed steady, his gaze resting on the older officer's face, watching each layer of confusion peel back with every breath. In the sweep of blue and red light, the man's skin turned pale, the ridge of his nose twitching, his lips pressed so thin they lost all color. A car passed on the opposite road, headlights crossing, flashing Wilkins's face white as paper. The brightness vanished as quickly as it came, leaving a dense darkness that echoed the quickened heartbeats of men who knew they had stepped too far to retreat cleanly. Elias tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but solid. "Do you want more proof?" Wilkins swallowed again, his breath shallow, sweat beading across his forehead. The older officer shook his head once, as if every rehearsed line had turned to ash. We didn't know," he said slowly, voice trembling. If you... Elias set the badge on the tray so it lay flat, the metal edge catching the blinking patrol lights in a cold, dull gleam. His hand lowered to rest on his thigh, fingers curling slightly. "You did know," Elias said evenly. "You knew the moment you saw it." Another gust swept by, circling dry dust around the wheels. The smell of tar, wilted grass, and leftover anger mixed into an air that burned the throat. Inside it, Elias recognized the old scent of fear, the fear of men who believed their power had no limits until they stood at its final edge. Wilkins bowed his head, his breath breaking into heavy rasps. The older officer clenched both hands, cords rising along his neck. After a long moment, he exhaled, lips pressed colorless. "We will record this," he said hoarsely. "I didn't mean..." Elias cut in, his gaze steady. "Meant or not, it already happened." No one answered. The wind whipped up again, making the badge rattle softly on the tray. That small sound felt like the last knock, sealing away their crumbling pride. A cold gust swept along the road, stirring a thin swirl of dust around Wilkins's shoes. His hand lifted halfway, fingers curling uncertainly in the air, as if he did not know where to place it. Under the red and blue flashes of the patrol lights, Wilkins's face gradually lost its composure, revealing a worry he could no longer hide. "Sir, this..." His voice caught in his throat, so quiet Elias had to tilt his head to hear. The sentence hung unfinished in the darkness, no explanation following. The older officer did not answer, his expression blank, eyes locked on the badge in Elias's hand, as if he had never imagined seeing it there. A sedan stopped at the far edge of the road. Its headlights cast a pale beam across Wilkins's chest. The man in the driver's seat turned his head, raising a phone to eye level, his finger trembling slightly as the camera panned across Elias and the officer. The screen glowed with a dim blue light, reflecting wavering shadows that inched forward with each heartbeat. Wilkins glanced over, his breathing quickening. The older officer lifted his gaze, seeing himself captured in the recording, his face first loosening, then tightening into a crease of fear. A second later, his hand shook, index finger jerking on the car door edge, as if searching for something solid. Another vehicle rolled closer, headlights sweeping over the gravel before cutting off. A window lowered halfway, revealing a middle-aged woman holding a phone, her face showing a mix of hesitation and curiosity. Her camera wobbled in her grip, the wind whistling through the gap, filling the mic with a low roar. Elias did not turn his head, his eyes fixed on the older officer, staring as if no more tension was needed to keep the line taut. Every sound seemed to slow. Wilkins's shoes grinding the gravel, the shallow breathing of the man who had spoken, the steady patrol engine. All of it formed the backdrop for the moment the cameras began recording. "Give me your badge number." Elias's voice was low, never rising, but clear enough that no one could pretend not to hear. The officer dropped his eyes, eyelids flickering as if searching for a decent reply, only to find none left. "Sir?" Wilkins rasped. "They are recording. Turn them off." The older man interrupted, his voice dry as old cloth. "Everyone turn them off." That tone held no confidence. It sounded only like an attempt to reassure himself, to grasp some control under the eyes fixed on him. But none of the people with phones seemed willing to comply. The man in the sedan clenched the phone tighter, chin lifting, his gaze steady. "Your badge number?" Wilkins stammered. The officer closed his eyes for a beat, as if he had to empty his lungs just to force the words out. "My number, 3172. Elias nodded, hand lowering the badge to his thigh. The cold metal glinted under the flashing lights, each engraved letter catching the glow like an inescapable mark. A draft swirled into the car, carrying damp earth and dust across the man's uniform. At the end of the road, 2 more cars began rolling forward, their headlights lined up in a row, stretching the shadows of the 3 men into long, warped shapes on the pavement. A deep male voice from one of the new cars called out, not loud but unmistakable, "Already recording." Wilkins's shoulders shrank, his head turning away. His hair was matted with sweat. The older officer raised his hand as if to protest, but when the headlights swept over his face, it fell limply to his side. In his eyes was something not quite anger, not entirely regret, but a raw confusion of realizing the interrogation had lost all force. Elias leaned into the seat, his gaze never leaving them. Part of him felt drained, another part lighter, as if every time he had been questioned in his life had gathered here, settling into this quiet. There were no arguments, no shouting, only the silent cameras capture each last second of collapsing certainty. The first sedan began to pull away, but the man inside kept the phone raised, watching Elias through the glass. As the car passed slowly, Elias saw his head dip in a small nod, an acknowledgement that needed no words. A cold breath drifted over Elias's shoulder, brushing the metal badge in his lap, leaving a thin film of moisture on the letter. A woman's voice rose from a nearby car, startled but tinged with respect. "He is Internal Affairs." Elias did not turn. He kept his hand resting on his thigh, breathing deep and steady, eyes fixed past the older officer's shoulder. In that moment, the man stepped half a pace back, hands falling from the doorframe, shoulders sagging. The blinking lights swept across his pale face, highlighting the creases in his brow like an unspoken confession. The night wind blew across the old dust, filling the air with the scorched smell of the road. Everything fell silent. Only the slow, deliberate movement of the cameras remained. Inside the car, Elias closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again. He did not need any more questions. All the evidence was already here, shining in the darkness that people believed they alone had the power to define. A strong gust swept along the road, bending the bare branches low. Their shadows slid across the older officer's shoulder, tracing a faint tremor he couldn't hide. Elias stayed still, his hand resting on the badge, eyes fixed on the face that lowered bit by bit, the face of a man who called himself the one in control. "I don't—" The officer's voice broke out like an unfinished confession. Those 2 words had no ending, no weight left from the authority he once believed unshakable. The sound snapped off, falling into the darkness, thick with the smell of dust and shame. Wilkins looked up at his colleague, his chin twitching slightly. His face showed plain confusion, hands folded over his stomach, his wrinkled uniform speaking for all the bewilderment. Across the street, a bystander still held up a phone, the blue glow lighting the older officer's trembling shoulders. The patrol lights flashed in a long pulse, red glinting on the sweat shining along the man's temple. In that moment, Elias saw the blurred line the officer had stepped over, from enforcer to someone cornered by his actions. "I don't think—" The next words died. The officer dropped his hand from the car window, arm hanging limp, gaze lowered, as if trying to avoid Elias's eyes. The patrol light spun, throwing red and blue stripes over the road, bouncing back against the windshield. In that glow, the bowed figure seemed cut off from any trace of its former pride. Elias drew in a breath, his chest expanding with a heavy pull. He had waited many years for this moment, not for revenge, but so those insults would have nowhere left to hide. His fingers brushed the badge's edge, the cold metal sinking through his skin, more solid than any tangled excuse. A creak sounded as the car across the street inched forward. The person filming panned the lens slowly, eyes unblinking. In that frame, Wilkins stepped back half a pace, his mouth pressed shut, both shoulders caving. Elias said nothing. His gaze stayed level, fixed on the older officer, neither yielding nor needing to show any bitterness. The silence now wasn't covering anything but exposing the emptiness behind every threat. The patrol lights blinked again, each sweep across the pavement outlining the distance between them, cracked beyond repair. The dried dust mixed with old gas from the engine, filling Elias's lungs with the sharp smell of a night stretched to exhaustion. Wilkins swallowed, his eyes flicking to the older man, waiting for an order. But the man didn't answer. His breathing came in ragged bursts, his shoulders shaking, as if his chest resisted any more words. "What do you want now?" the officer asked, his voice low, breaking into pieces. Elias kept silent for another moment. In the man's wide eyes he saw his reflection, small but unmistakable, proof no one could deny. Tonight there was no citation, no further question that could cover up the plain truth. "I don't want anything more," Elias said evenly. "I have enough." The words fell into the quiet, echoing like a soft sound, heavier than any shout. Another car eased past, its headlights slanting along the side of Elias's vehicle, catching his hand on the badge in warm gold. For an instant, the officer's face turned pale, his eyelids trembling once more. Wilkins dropped his eyes to his shoes. His shoulders sank like a man with no strength left to cling to any pretense. A draft swept by, scattering the papers on the hood, making them flutter and drift onto the asphalt. The patrol light spun once more, red catching the bowed figure. In Elias's eyes, the scene was stiflingly still, like the room where he had once questioned men, convinced they would never have to answer for anything. No one spoke. Silence closed in on all sides. A cold night with no more footsteps, no more interrogations. No more certainty to shore up the gap that had collapsed into a chasm. Elias leaned fully back against the seat. His eyes left the lowered face, rising to the strip of blinking lights. In the shifting colors, he knew it was over. Nothing left to add or subtract. The power they leaned on had cracked from within, a fracture that would never mend. The night wind slipped through the cracked window, brushing Elias's nape with a thin chill that reminded him the confrontation was not over. Inside the car, the smell of road dust and the stale heater air thickened into a dry layer that made every breath sound like old paper being crushed. He stared straight through the glass, meeting the gaze of the older officer, eyes drooping as if about to break. In that moment, Elias realized he no longer needed anyone to grant him validation. He had reached the far edge of patience where truth required no explanation, only to be called by name. He lowered his head and quietly unlocked his phone. The screen lit with a soft green glow, casting a pale reflection across Wilkins's tense cheekbones. The lines of numbers and letters appeared clear as the trace of memory Elias had etched long ago. His finger slid across the screen, slow and precise, not a second of hesitation. Each movement peeled away the dull layer of dust from the old file, returning it to the sharpest clarity. The wind outside scratched along the metal, a steady background to the words he was about to speak. Civil Complaint File number 7481. Wilkins stiffened. His eyes flicked immediately to the older officer. A silence dropped over the gravel, heavier than any question before it. The officer did not answer. He only looked at Elias, the corner of his eye twitching like a muscle no longer obeying command. The patrol light pulsed again, throwing his shadow in a warped shape across the pavement. Elias lifted his face, his voice low but steady. "Do you want me to repeat the content of the complaint?" No one replied. The wind moved past, making the edge of the officer's coat slap lightly against his belt. The loose papers stacked on the hood rustled, small sounds loud in a space that had already cracked apart. Wilkins wet his lips. His eyes turned in a brief circle before dropping to the tips of his shoes. For an instant, he looked like a man realizing he stood on a line he could not cross back. Elias spoke again, each word calm, so they sounded colder than the night air. The traffic stop without cause, repeated demands for papers and vehicle inspection, paired with overt public insults. April 24th, last year. Wilkins sucked in a tight breath. The older officer shook his head faintly, the corners of his mouth parting as if to argue, but he had no strength left. His face drained of color, lips pressed to a thin line. In those eyes, part denial and part fear, Elias saw the memory of that night nearly a year before, when this file landed on his desk with a note, "It may never be properly handled." Elias did not lower his eyes, holding his gaze firm over the confusion splitting open layer by layer. "Did you forget the name of the complainant?" His voice fell, dry and low, like an old reminder. A long second passed before the officer could speak. The patrol light swept by, outlining the veins rising in his neck like cords about to snap. "You," the officer's lips trembled, voice raw, "you were the one who approved that file?" Elias neither nodded nor shook his head. He left the phone resting in his palm, its screen lit bright with the file number the other man once believed buried. "This is not the first time," Elias said, each word measured. "And I recognized you from the first moment." Another gust rose, lifting a thin film of dust across the road and dropping it into the dark. The smell of scorched weeds from yesterday mingled with tonight's damp cold, curling around the officer's shoulders until he gave a small shiver. Wilkins reached out, laying his hand lightly on his colleague's arm as if to pull him out of the raw moment, then let it fall again, his palm dropping to his side. In those young eyes, Elias saw regret flicker up, not yet lasting long enough to turn into an apology. The older officer murmured, voice downcast, his gaze refusing to lift. "I didn't think." The half-formed excuse dissolved into the wind, and no one bothered to collect it. The patrol lights blinked in a steady rhythm, like a bell tolling out the order they had relied on to deny others. Every pretext for the stop had run dry, leaving only a single fact. This was never a chance encounter. Elias leaned back, the ache spreading slowly along his spine, heavy as an interrogation winding to its end. He had nothing more to say because the night had already told the rest. As the blue light swept across the older officer's graying hair, Elias knew everything had reached the final stretch, where each man was left to carry the image he had built to hide himself. The night wind swept along the gravel road, brushing a thin gray film of dust across the patrol car door. Inside the cab, Elias sat still, hand resting lightly on his phone, its faint warmth at odds with the cold seeping in through the crack in the window. The acrid scent of asphalt crept under his collar, a reminder that the night was not over, and some things never end just because people want to forget. His eyes stayed on the older officer's face, that pale expression cracking apart in layers of confusion. The flashing patrol light revealed sweat beading on his temple, gathering into a drop that slid away into the folds of his thick coat. Elias watched that flickering glow without seeing it tonight anymore. What came to him instead was the image of an old records room at the end of a long corridor, the air dense with the smell of damp paper steeped in time. One late afternoon last year, the last light fell through the barred window, laying striped shadows across cabinets crowded with files. The clock ticked in slow, hollow beats, each one a reminder that everything is eventually shoved into oblivion. He remembered the faded gray folder, a dirty mark like old coffee dried onto the corner so firmly it could not be lifted. Every time he touched it, his fingertips felt cold and rough, like brushing tree bark. The colleague who handed it over was a senior inspector with graying hair and a smoker's husky voice, murmuring, "Think this through. That name is not easy to confront." Elias had not looked up. He quietly pushed his chair back, opened the file, and spread the papers across the worn table. Under the slanting sun, the typewritten lines stood out sharper than any spoken account. He read slowly, line by line, never rushing. His eyes paused longest on the passage describing how the officer had stopped the car, searched it, then sneered, "You have no right to be wandering around here, understand?" He thought he could hear that voice echoing through the empty room, full of contempt. Maybe it was not real, just memory repeating itself, something it had learned to do after hearing the same words dozens, hundreds of times, always identical in an almost obscene way. In the hallway, the light was fading, shadows of the window stretching over the floor marked with dried mud from an old rainy season. The room was stale with dust, but Elias did not feel stifled. Instead, he felt acutely awake, almost unnervingly so, as if realizing this investigation would not end with an easy apology. His eyes settled on the witness statement, the writer's name trembling, the pen halting mid-sentence again and again. "I was sitting still, not resisting. I only asked why my car was stopped. He looked at me like I was a dog." Then, Elias had not closed his eyes. He set the pen beside the file, pressing a fingertip to the plastic edge of the ruler, slowly, to test if his hand was shaking. His gaze fixed on the last blank box on the receipt, approval for preliminary investigation. He remembered the calm he felt, a cold clarity. Outside, the daylight was gone, leaving a soft darkness draped over the roofs of cars in the yard. The chill rising from the tile floor curled around his cuffs, carrying the stale scent of his earliest days in the department, when he believed a complete file would be enough to let truth speak for itself. The pen touched down, one neat, deliberate signature, blue ink soaking evenly into the thin lines. A faint scratch, like a door gently closing. He set the pen aside, drawing a long breath to let the cold seep into his lungs. From that moment on, every meeting that followed could never again be called accidental. In that instant, the officer's face, bowed low by the patrol car, became painfully close. Every crease of his frown, the eyes clouding with fear, the quivering mouth forced to remember. The feeling Elias had imagined in that records room afternoon was now more real than any typed sentence. The officer stammered, voice breaking. "I thought the file was suspended." Elias did not blink. He kept his breathing slow and steady, the way he had in that sunless office. Outside, the patrol lights clattered and flashed over the officer's stooped shoulders in pale red. "The file still exists," Elias said, voice low, "and it was never closed." A car passed on the opposite side, its headlights glancing across the road and catching the dusty edge of the man's coat in a cold beam. In that moment of light, he looked up halfway, staring at Elias with fear he could no longer hide. "You do not," he whispered, almost voiceless. "You do not understand everything. It is over." "You tell yourself that to feel safe," Elias replied, dipping his head slightly. "But you know it is not true." Wilkins turned his face away, his shoulders trembling, his hand clutching the edge of his strap. For a moment, no one spoke again. The night wind passed through, making the dust on the patrol car's hood trickle down in tiny grains that sounded, each one like regret falling in the end. A chill ran down Elias's spine. It was not fear, but the feeling of the past rearing up whole, watching him and the man who had once believed he would never have to bow his head, and laying everything everything bare. He let that cold settle into his chest, a reminder this confrontation was not over and perhaps never would be, no matter when the patrol lights finally went dark. A final gust swept along the road, lifting old dust from the car's door sill into a faint swirl that vanished into the darkness. The patrol lights still blinked, but the red and blue glow now looked weary, as if even it had exhausted itself after so much display. Elias stayed leaning back in the car, eyes on the older officer's face bowed low, shoulders slumped, stripped of any trace of an interrogator's posture. Wilkins stood half a step away, his gaze unfocused, one hand fumbling at the edge of his belt. The sedan across the street had turned off its headlights, but its window was down, letting the blue light of a phone screen shine across the driver's face. Trembling fingers clutched the phone, recording the whole scene, the dark badge catching the light, the officer's pale face, and Elias's voice steady as a blade, splitting open smugness. They were not alone. 3 more cars had pulled up slowly behind, each occupant holding a phone, cameras aimed at the short stretch of gravel where a routine check had turned into a night that exposed everything. When Elias glanced over, the blue screens lit up faces white with astonishment, curiosity, or something uncertain between belief and fear. Gas fumes mixed in the air with the ticking of the signal lights and whispers too soft to hear. A man behind the wheel of the nearest car murmured, "Did you get it? Send it to me now." A woman's voice cut in, sharper. "That old guy's finished, playing games with internal affairs." The night breeze slipped through the crack in the window, carrying the unfinished words away, but not the thrill and unease of the small crowd gathering. Every eye followed Elias's slightest motion, waiting for another turn, as if hoping the night would not end yet. A young man stood near the shoulder, phone raised high, his screen flickering under the patrol lights. He spoke between breaths. "Look, everyone, this is live, over 2,000 watching." Elias did not move. He felt an odd beat in his chest, neither fatigue nor peace, a half calm like a clean wind passing over ruins after the storm. The older officer drew a short breath, lifted his head halfway, eyes brushing Elias's, before dropping almost at once. He spoke softly, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean—" "You don't have to say anything," Elias replied, voice neither cold nor pitying. "Everyone has heard enough." And they had. Every person behind the glass, every pair of eyes bright in the screen's glow, every low voice starting to ripple. Comments rolled across the phones in long rows. One read, "This is real justice." Another mocked, "Try explaining it again." Mixed in were voices blaming and dismissing. "Just payback, making a fuss that won't change a thing." Elias did not turn. He heard it all, each word passing without sticking. Deep down, he knew the truth was never believed by everyone at first. That was exactly why it had to be repeated, until no one dared pretend not to see. A woman's voice near him, unsteady with cold or excitement, said, "I'm posting this on the news group right now. People have to see it." Wilkins glanced at Elias, his eyes lost, like someone stepping too far into mud with no handhold left. The older officer did not respond, shoulders folding further, one hand gripping his collar as if to keep steady. He whispered, "I didn't think it would end like this." Elias lowered his eyes to the badge on his thigh, the metal edge catching the patrol lights in a bright flicker, like an answer needing no words. He closed the wallet slowly, no rush at all. As he pressed it shut, the crackling live stream carried a voice loud and clear. "This is real justice." The flood of comments rose higher. Someone laughed dryly, another cursed, one wrote only, "Deserved," then went silent. Every clip, every piece of live stream was being sent out, multiplying into hundreds, thousands of views. In that moment, Elias knew he had reached the last boundary of the old power, the one that once felt unbreakable. He opened the door and stepped out. The smell of dry grass and cold dust clung to his cuffs, reminding him of the records room last year. The same heavy quiet as tonight. The patrol lights flashed across his cheek, showing half the bowed face of the officer who could no longer look up. Elias shut the door behind him. His hand held the wallet, red and blue, glinting in a pale halo. He spoke no more, because everything had been witnessed and recorded, beyond erasing. Behind him, a man's voice rumbled through the live stream. "If you ever try this again, there will be more men like him." And then no one dared to speak. The night seemed to sink another notch lower over the pavement as Elias closed the car door behind him. The latch clicked softly, final, like an ending that needed no emphasis. In the pale glow spreading from the patrol lights, the older officer's face looked drained, his chin trembling as he watched Elias step forward. The wind carried the smell of dry grass, dust, and old gasoline, all mixing into an air that tightened the chest. The red and blue lights rotated in long sweeps, casting stains across the road that looked like blood soaking through the gravel. Elias did not blink, his gaze fixed on the figure bent over, the back seeming to shrink in the moment all excuses had dried up. The officer's voice broke out, so hoarse it sounded like someone else speaking through his mouth. His lips pressed together, then quivered. He tried to say more, but his throat closed as if something blocked it. Elias stood unmoving, hands loose by his sides, his breath slow and deep, like a man who had given up any thought of filling the space with more words. The wind picked up, rushing along the road, making the patrol lights sway on the roof. That glow swept across the officer's eye sockets, revealing pupils shrinking tight with fear. A bead of sweat slid from his hairline to the crease by his mouth before vanishing. In that instant, all the false authority he had carried through his career seemed to dissolve like wet paper. "I'm sorry." The words broke apart, thin and unsteady. A woman standing by a car across the street lifted her hand to her mouth. Her phone screen stayed lit, shining on the officer's pale face, his lips shaking as if he might cry. The night held perfectly still, like a lake with no ripples. But something in everyone's eyes had already changed. Elias did not look away. Deep down, he realized he felt no satisfaction. The anger that had clung to his chest throughout this confrontation had drained away, leaving only a weariness he could not name. He felt the wind slide through his coat, cold against his skin. The night stretched on endlessly, refusing to let anyone slip into darkness to hide their shame. "I didn't think it would turn out like this," the officer stammered, his voice coming apart in pieces. "I didn't." The blue and red light flickered over, staining his nose with a cold glow. Wilkins still stood frozen, his hand clamped on the edge of his belt until the knuckles went white, his gaze drifting far away as if praying this moment was only a bad dream. Low voices whispered around them, small exclamations, muttered curses, and embarrassed murmurs no one dared to speak aloud. A car in the distance crawled closer, its headlights laying more yellow across the pavement. The officer's shadow stretched long and warped, shaped exactly like fear laid bare. He pulled in his shoulders, tried to speak, then faltered, his breath wheezing out like air from an old hose. Elias lowered his head slightly, eyes stopping on the dusty line along the car's threshold. He remembered a night many years before, when he was still an untested recruit, those long patrol shifts where every superior's order was the absolute truth, and everyone believed that wearing a badge meant no one would ever ask why. Back then, he had promised himself he would never forget what it felt like to be looked at with that contempt. "I truly," the officer whispered, his chin dipping. "I'm sorry." The words came so faint that Elias had to tilt his head to catch them fully. They carried no weight now, no authority, only the broken fragments of an old conviction. One long night had stripped everything bare, so that even he no longer knew how to hide behind the uniform. The patrol lights slowed, red and blue blending to a pale violet that spread across Elias's face. In that moment he stood motionless, like a stone, the last guard over his dignity before dawn came. A man across the street lowered his phone, his voice trembling as he turned to the woman beside him. "He didn't have to say anything, but everyone understands." She gripped his arm tightly, her eyes fixed on that unmoving figure. The officer tried to whisper, but the sound died away. His breath came fast, as if there wasn't enough air for another sentence. In the final glow of headlights from the last car arriving, his face revealed all its exhaustion and fear, an expression no one imagined seeing on the man who had shouted commands hours before. Elias did not answer, did not shift, did not close his eye. He stood where he was, letting his gaze rest on the bowed back, so everyone could witness the last moment of a fallen mask. Then the crowd fell silent. No words of comfort, no one dared to break the hush. In the fading flashes of light, everyone understood that the night had ended with a moment no one could escape. The night wind swept across the road, spinning grit around Elias's shoes before curling up against the patrol car's door, leaving a pale dust. The red and blue lights still turned in slow circles, each rotation dragging as if even they had worn out after a long night, stretching every boundary. Elias stood motionless, chin tipped slightly, eyes locked on the bowed head in front of him. The faint smell of smoke drifted across the asphalt, mixing with the cold tar in the air, a stale scent that clung to the back of his throat. The older officer's shadow was bent and broken in the blurred glow. A figure anyone could see no longer held the pride it carried earlier that evening. Lie. The man's voice scraped out, hoarse and frail. His lips pressed tight, then trembled, throat jerking as if caught between fear and a dying pride. Elias did not blink, letting the silence thicken, solid between them. A strong gust hissed along the road, rattling the parked cars and making the phones held up by onlookers sway in their hands. The blue glow lit the faces around them, showing the uneasy fascination of those witnessing something they never expected. "I am not," the officer pulled a ragged breath, shoulders lifting as he forced the words out. "I am not afraid of you the way you think." The outburst sliced the quiet like a last desperate blow. The patrol lights swept sideways, red beams catching his face, highlighting pupils that shrank with anger, fear, and raw bitterness. Elias did not move. He held the stare as the words fell into the heavy darkness, exposing themselves as emptier than they were brave. The steady rumble of the patrol engine blended with the wind into a flat background no one dared to interrupt. A man by the sedan drew a sharp breath, lowering his phone to his chest, eyes wide. The woman beside him clutched her coat tighter, breathing shallowly. Neither spoke, only watching the officer's face twist in the moment he realized his weakness had been dragged out into the open. He shouted, his voice cracking, "I am not afraid!" But as the last word broke free, his shoulders jerked, eyes darting in confusion. Under the blinking lights, the rage dissolved so fast it looked pitiful, leaving nothing but raw emptiness. His voice fell into ragged gasps, loud as a man waking from a nightmare he could not escape. Elias stood still. The cold crept up the back of his neck, slicing along his spine, but his breathing stayed slow and even. His hand tightened at his side, each knuckle pressing into the fabric until it went numb. He did not speak right away. The silence alone made the officer's shout feel smaller, weaker than any excuse. Another hush swept the lot. The patrol light swung half a turn, flickering across silver hair, and the slow drop of sweat sliding from the officer's temple to his cheek. He swallowed hard, Adam's apple twitching, unable to speak again. Elias lowered his chin, his voice dry and low, like the pavement drained of every trace of moisture. "You just gave me a reason to investigate further." No one mistook what that meant. A young man nearby sucked in a breath, his hand shaking around his phone. The woman across the street shook her head, her eyes startled. In the pulse of the lights, the officer stared at Elias, stunned that he had pushed this far himself. Elias did not frown. He looked straight at the man whose shoulders had collapsed, whose eyes were wide with a fear and despair he could not hide. Every apology, every threat, every plea had fallen beyond the edge of this moment. A cold gust scraped across Elias's face, dry and carrying the smell of dead weeds. His hand eased open, his exhale slow and steady. He knew this night would not end with a handshake. It would not close with the words, "It was all a misunderstanding." This time, the crack had become a rift no one could cover. "And this time," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, final note, "you will not escape." The words were not loud, but they landed with the weight of iron. Someone in the crowd murmured, voice trembling, "God, that sentence." The wind rushed over the roof, trailing the stale dust. The patrol lights kept turning with a tired click. In that instant, the officer bowed his head, shoulders caving in, breath catching like a man choking on defeat. No one dared to speak. No one dared to turn away, because everyone knew that sentence had fallen over the night like fate. Elias remained still. His eyes never left the lowered face, leaving a silence heavier than any accusation. And in that quiet, everyone understood there was no way back. The night wind swept along the road, lifting small pebbles that scattered around Elias's cuffs. With each step forward, the dry dust rose again, circling his ankles before fading under the dim yellow glow from the scattered parked cars. The smell of dry grass hung in the air, the scent of cooling asphalt settling as a bitter tang at the back of his throat. The patrol lights kept spinning, red and blue blinking like an old breath growing more labored. In that glow, the older officer's shoulder moved slightly, as if the last strength left in him had slipped away. His shoulders sank lower, never lifting again. The voice that came out was no longer shaped into a sentence, just a breath dragged through a locked throat into a hollow sound. His lips twitched, one hand dangling along his side, shaking like a frayed string about to snap. In a sweep of red light, Elias saw the nose gone pale, the clouded eyes unable to look up. He stood less than 2 steps away, motionless. The wind slapped cold along his jaw, but in his chest this heartbeat stayed calm as ever. No anger, no pity. This silence had been prepared long before, born of files hidden away, of sneers no report ever recorded. Wilkins shifted his foot. He turned his face aside as if afraid Elias's gaze would stick to him. His hand fumbled at the strap across his chest, then dropped along his hip. In the dim light, his face looked bloodless, his pupils fluttering between confusion and dread. A voice from across the street called out, rough and wary, "He's about to collapse." But Elias did not hear, or if he did, he let it pass without touching him. He kept his eyes steady on the figure sinking inch by inch. The long night crawled through every shadow, the smell of sharp dust rising as a sign that all illusions of power had been blown away. One green light went out, leaving only the red blinking slowly. That beam lit half the officer's face, cutting a deep shadow along his cheek. His mouth quivered again, then shut without forming words. Each breath came in heavy bursts, hanging in front of him like thin smoke. "I did not," he exhaled, voice fractured, "did not think this would—" The sound trailed off, so weak no one in the crowd caught the rest. A woman tilted her head, holding her phone aimed steady, eyes wide and unblinking. In the blue screen glow, the officer's shoulders folded like an old tree rotting free of its roots. Elias tipped his head, watching the hunched shoulders in the red light. He did not step closer or back, only held the distance so the other man would know there was nowhere left to retreat. For this moment alone, the truth could not be filed away like an unfinished report. Wilkins bit his lip, staring down at his shoes. He drew in a breath as if swallowing a deep ache, then let it out in a shiver. The night refused to recede. The smell of asphalt, worn cloth, and fresh humiliation mixed into an air that tasted bitter as ash. Another gust blew past, smearing dust across the windshield in a pale streak. The red light blinked again, catching the sweat that slid from the officer's temple to his collar. He sank halfway to his knees, bracing a hand against the cart as if slipping into an unseen pit. He stammered, "I have nothing left." No one supplied the missing words. Everyone stared, eyes unblinking. In that spill of light, Elias saw the shape of defeat appear, nothing left to shield it. He did not shift his shoulders, did not lower his head. His gaze held steady, unmoving, as the last wall against every hollow excuse. The night air slipped behind his collar, leaving a hidden shiver. A man across the road spoke low, voice drained. "It's over. He's not getting up again." The patrol lights flickered a few more times, each flash weaker. The officer's shadow stretched across the gravel, twisted and pale. Wilkins slowly bowed his head, shoulders drooping. No one spoke. The breath of the whole lot pressed into one heavy sound, as if all were hearing the collapse no one could stop. Elias stayed motionless. His eyes left the bent shoulders, drifted over the mottled light on the road, and settled on the last dark stretch ahead. He did not look back. He knew, on this night, there was nothing left for anyone to say, himself included. One last red flash blinked, silent, then went out, like the final breath of an old power. and no one dared raise their voice to break that silence. The night wind began to fade, blowing only in scattered gusts along the gravel road. The patrol lights flashed one last time, their red and blue pulsing like a failing breath, then went out completely, returning the darkness in full over the cold stretch of asphalt. The older officer was still hunched by the car's side, his back rigid as if nailed to the ground, drained of all strength. Elias stood a few steps away, the wind brushing past the edge of his coat with a thin chill. The space around them seemed to sink deeper, thick with silence. Every eye stayed fixed on the smallest movement, every phone held high, but no one dared speak. The patrol car began to move. The engine turned over, shivering under the gravel. Its low, heavy sound carried like the breathing of an old beast, trying to stand after a fight it had already lost by believing it could not fall. The officer did not walk to the driver's seat. Wilkins came around to help him, one hand on his shoulder, the other pulling the door open. For an instant, the headlights swept across Elias, lighting a face steady and unshaken. The wheels rolled slowly over the road, grit crackling under the rubber. The entire lot held its breath. Something in the engine's groan and the quiet retreat of the car left behind the sense of a night that had drained away every pretense of authority. As it disappeared, darkness closed over the gap behind it, more empty and cold than before. Elias let out a long breath, pushing the chill collected in his lungs all night. The smell of dust, dry grass, and cooling asphalt lingered in the air, clinging to his hair and collar, reminding him none of this could be undone. The wind slid across his cheek, leaving a dull numbness. A man in an old coat stepped from the nearest car, holding a small black camcorder. The record light kept blinking, a tiny red dot shining against the tense line of his jaw. As he neared Elias, he lowered his head a little, his voice rough from cold and nerves. "Mr. Carter," he said, "do you have anything you'd like to say to the public?" The question fell, quiet as a pebble sinking to the lake bed. In that moment, Elias felt his heart beat once. So long it seemed the sound had to travel a great distance to reach his chest again. He did not answer right away. His eyes moved past the reporter, pausing on the tire marks pressed into the gravel. He thought of his father, a mechanic who had taught him that the only thing worth trusting was the tool in his hand. He thought of nights alone, reviewing complaint files, with only the clock's patient ticking as company. And he knew this moment would never come back. The wind died altogether. Everyone stood silent. A car's headlights clicked on, lighting the patchy ground. Elias lifted his chin, his voice deep without needing force. Elias did not speak immediately. His gaze passed over the lens, then turned to the black road where the patrol car had vanished. He knew from that second the story no longer belonged to him alone. It had become a record everyone in this town, and perhaps far beyond, would have to face. The wind paused, as if to hear him. Elias lowered his eyes, his voice slow and certain. "Don't be afraid of the truth." A shiver passed through the lot. Someone exhaled sharply. Someone wiped their eyes. Someone kept their phone lifted without blinking. The dust in the air began to thin, making room for the first hint of dawn slipping down from the distant tree line, colder and clearer. The patrol car was gone, leaving only the dull red trace of its taillights, a weary mark from the long night. A voice in the crowd murmured, hoarse, "It's over." But Elias knew it was not truly finished. The next morning, a gray sky dusted dew over the cars lined in front of the Internal Affairs building. The air was not bitter, but a lingering gloom pressed against the roof of the dark brick hall, as if the shadow of the night still refused to lift. When Elias stepped onto the main steps, the parking lot was already packed. They wore suits and thick jackets, their faces hidden behind cameras of every size. Flashbulbs strobed in quick bursts, sending hard white spots flickering over Elias's shoes. No one called out a greeting. Everyone waited. A blonde reporter, holding a microphone with the city's biggest news network logo, broke from the line, her voice clear and precise. "Mr. Carter, last night you did what many would never dare, but some say you only wanted to show off personal power. How do you respond?" The morning wind swept across the road, sending fallen leaves sliding thin over the steps. Elias did not lower his eyes. He had been ready since he left that road hours ago. Mornings like this were always a mix: curiosity, admiration, suspicion. A younger reporter, voice ragged from no sleep, lifted a microphone close to his chin. "Do you think public reaction will damage the patrol force's credibility?" Elias looked straight past them, his breathing calm, his gaze steady. The badge in his coat pocket brushed lightly against his chest, a reminder that truth never comes from opinion. It comes from moments with no room left for deceit. He stepped half a pace back, giving the lens enough space to frame his whole face. His voice came low, firm, without sharpness. Last night was never about flaunting authority. Last night was so that everyone understands no one should be afraid when they speak the truth. A camera shutter clicked. For a moment, all the questions stopped. The morning wind passed over the steps, cool but clearer than the night air. The people beyond the security rail did not look away. Suspicion met silent respect in dozens of unblinking stares. The screen of a camera in the back flickered on, a line of text scrawling across the edge of the frame. "Don't be afraid of the truth." Elias did not move. The ache from the long night still pulsed through his bones, but he knew he had crossed the point of no return, and for the first time, he was not afraid. The sun rose slowly over the parking lot, still speckled with dew, pale gold light filtering through the frosted glass of the third-floor conference room. Inside the long room, walls crowded with dense information boards, the air felt thick, like residue left after a night when no one slept. The stale scent of cold coffee blended with old printer paper, forming a sour trace of tension and doubt. Elias leaned lightly against the long table, his internal affairs badge beside his elbow, the metal face cold, reflecting the dawn. In front of him, 6 people sat in a row, faces pale, eyelids swollen from staying awake. They looked at each other, then down at the open file, where the suspension reports of the 2 officers lay on top. A broad-shouldered man with a deep, uneven voice spoke first. "I don't think we should stir this up anymore. Last night was enough. Suspension alone could signal something bad to the public." Another man, hair graying, jaw tight for the past hour, tapped the file's edge. "You say a bad signal? Do you know how fast that clip spread? It's already on national broadcasts this morning. If we keep covering, we'll lose everything." "No one said cover it," the broad man muttered, wiping sweat off his forehead. "But if we throw them out now, we're admitting this system is rotten to the core." Elias didn't look away. He had expected this argument the moment he climbed the station stairs. Collapse never comes all at once. It begins with tired excuses, then swells into panic when everyone sees that no shield is thick enough anymore. A woman at the end of the table, hands knotted together, spoke in a rasp. "We have to act. Even suspending them is a clear step. If we don't, we can't expect public trust." The broad man clenched his teeth. "You want to make them scapegoats?" "I want justice to be plain," she replied. "Whoever did this must be accountable." Silence pressed the room, heavy and stifling. Elias set his palm flat on the table, fingertips touching the file's edge. He let the cold of the cover soak into his skin, clearing his head. A draft of morning air slipped through the cracked window, scattering the coffee smell into the corner. "I'm not here to listen to you all fear the image in your mirror," Elias said, slow and even. "I'll remind you, each of you signed documents swearing no one is above the law." The broad man blinked quickly, jaw flexing. He started to speak, then only exhaled, voice rough. "Then what do you want?" Elias did not shift. "I want the file reopened. Every page. I want a clear disciplinary ruling. No vagueness, no delay." Another stretch of quiet spread, long as the last darkness before dawn. The glances passed around the table, tired and unsettled, but no one argued. Elias knew their silence wasn't agreement. It was the moment they ran out of excuses to deny it. Morning wind slipped through again. Outside, the station steps were crowded, thick with reporters, lenses, and microphones packed tight. Elias closed the file, stood straight, his voice lowering into a raw note. "You choose how fast you act, but if you don't, I'll release every hidden record." No one answered. He didn't wait. His hand squeezed the badge in his jacket, then he left the room, his footsteps echoing down the long hall. When Elias stepped onto the main steps, the dawn angled across the pavement, dewdrops clung to the railings, glittering like glass chips. The automatic door sealed behind him with a dry snap. Wind tugged his coat hem, carrying the bitter smell of asphalt. At the bottom of the stairs, the reporters had doubled since last night, cameras lifted as one, flashes bursting in rapid snaps. Voices overlapped, curious, angry, urgent. "Mr. Carter, do you think you're dividing your team? Are you afraid this will make the whole system collapse? Are you doing this for justice or to prove your power?" Elias paused on the highest step. He looked over them all, eyes level. The wind combed his hair back from his forehead, cold and blunt as questions no one wants to hear the answer to. He dipped his chin once. His voice came out slow, steady, not loud, but clear. "I'm not dividing anything. I'm just pulling down the curtain." The shutters snapped in waves. A young reporter pushed closer, microphone brushing his coat. "Do you believe the disciplinary decision will be fair?" Elias turned his gaze into the lens, voice unchanging. "Fairness doesn't come from decisions, it comes from truth being spoken." Another microphone appeared. A woman's voice wavered. "If public opinion turns on you, what then?" The morning gust struck his face. Elias held his stare. "I don't need anyone behind me," he said. "Truth stands alone." The air seemed to tighten for a beat. Shutter clicks fell silent, then resumed. In that moment, Elias felt no fatigue, no fear, only the quiet certainty he had felt last night when he looked into the eyes of a man forced to lower his head. A cameraman bent to check his screen. On it, Elias stood on the steps, gray coat shifting in the wind, gaze steady, unbowed. Across the bottom, the caption glowed in cold, white letters. "The cracks are spreading," and no one in the crowd dared to deny it. The early wind began to ease its chill as Elias walked down the steps, each slow stride numbing the soles of his feet from a night that had not yet dissolved. Behind him, dozens of camera lenses still followed, their red recording lights like silent eyes that would not let go. The smell of exhaust mixed with dust curled around the curb, clinging to his light gray coat with the same bitter scent as the night his father quietly cleared the repair shop, leaving no farewell. Elias stopped at the bottom step, eyes lowered to the rough asphalt. For an instant, memory rose whole and sharp enough to touch. A night as long as this one, but colder, when he was a 17-year-old boy standing by a scarred wooden door, listening to his father sigh heavy into air thick with the reek of engine oil. That night, his father sat with his back to the wall, sun-brown hands on his knees, knuckles swollen from the last blow of a young officer no report ever recorded. The air smelled of oil and dried blood, clinging to the edge of the workbench where tools lay scattered. Outside, the yellow street lights slanted through dusty glass, casting a pale ring across his father's shoulder and showing the bruise along his jaw, a silent warning. His father never looked at Elias, only shook his head and spoke in a voice gone hoarse after a day of questions over a fault no one cared to prove. The young officer's thin laugh still rang in Elias's ears, the voice that pressed his father's hand to the cold hood. "This old man thinks he's our equal. They won't pay," his father said softly, eyes on the dark beyond the door, his breath drawn as if wading through old muck of shame. "They have too many ways to slip away." Elias remembered gripping the doorknob so tight his palms sweated cold, his thumb trembling with anger rising from his chest to his throat. In that dim air that smelled of oil and sorrow, he felt a small resolve take root. Quiet, but harder than any fear. He did not cry or ask what his father would do, because even then he understood there were battles no one could line up for you, no one to lead you through. They began only when someone decided not to bow, even knowing the cost was to lose every calm night of sleep. The night wind slipped through the cracked window, making the rubber cord on the hook rattle. In that moment, Elias saw how his father's shoulders had thinned under the worn gray shirt, the creases at his eyes carved deep by all those years of endurance. Part of him wanted to cross the floor to help him stand, but something stronger held him back, something unnamed that would never let him turn away like everyone else. His voice then was raw, broken with too much anger and fear. He heard himself speak words he remembers to this day, every pause between them. "One day," Elias whispered, his hand clenched until numb, "I will make them pay." The words came out short and untested, but enough that his father turned, his tired, dark eyes searching half the dark workshop. That look was not hope, not pride, only a quiet settling, part sadness, part understanding, as if he had always known his son would step onto a road no one wished to walk. And that look, The brief lowering and lifting of his head became the only consent Elias ever needed, a promise never written but fixed in his spine from that night, so that this morning he still had the strength to stand tall, even with dozens of cameras waiting to tear apart any weakness. Wind combed across his hair, pulling him back to the present. The smell of smoke and dawn crept inside his collar, mixing with the dry taste on his tongue. Behind him on the steps, reporters murmured as they packed their gear. Someone held a damp early edition in hand, ink blurred by dew, the headline bold, as the closing argument of a trial not yet called to order. Is justice real? Elias lowered his head slightly. In his chest, the answer rises slowly, tasting of rust from all the years gone by. Justice exists, but it never comes by itself. It is drawn out, inch by inch, every line signed on a file, every night standing without retreat, every word spoken under 10 doubtful stares. He slowly unclenched the hand that had gone numb. The warmth of the Internal Affairs badge still touched through the cloth, reminding him that the old promise was not finished. Tonight, part of it had been kept, but in that moment, Elias also saw that no easy happiness comes with clarity. A feeling of complete and strange flooded him, raw enough to ache. That quiet satisfaction spread to his palm, then broke apart, leaving a taste sharp as it was hard to swallow. He knew he had done the right thing, and he knew that meant he would pay with more nights, more confrontations, more pieces of belief cracked further. He had to find a way, such as keep the villagers quiet, but the pieces of belief cracked further. A reporter's voice rose behind him, no longer harsh, only low and tired. "Mr. Carter, can you say simply why you still choose this path?" Elias did not turn fully. He let the wind carry the unfinished question, then looked down the line of parked cars. The morning mist was lifting, revealing every smear on the paint, every handprint on the glass. Nothing was ever completely clean, and maybe it did not have to be to deserve the light. His voice came low and hoarse after the long night, but steady, because justice has never been easy. One short sentence, solid, no adornment. At the bottom step, someone folded the paper quietly, their eyes lifted without doubt. Elias turned and stepped down each stair, shoulders straight, chin lifted. When his foot touched the damp street, he knew his father, somewhere, had heard this late answer, and for the first time he felt no need to apologize for keeping the promise all these years. The hallway on the second floor held the dull light of late morning, the fluorescent bulbs casting a cold, pale glow over the faded tiles, showing every trace of exhaustion and tension seeping into the old floor. A wooden door stood ajar, a small brass plaque on its surface etched with neat letters, Internal Affairs Review Room. The sound of shoes on the floor came slowly and heavy, like the ticking of a clock counting down the last moments. The older officer stepped across the threshold, his shoulders flinching as the white light fell straight onto his hair, streaked with gray. He stopped near the long table, his hand gripping the brim of an old patrol cap, the thin wrist trembling. On the table lay a thick file set in perfect order, the red cover stamped with cold letters. Emergency Disciplinary Review. Suspension Consideration. In the corner, a small camera blinked a red recording light, the black lens fixed on the lowered face, catching every tired tremor at the edge of his mouth. A man in a dark shirt spoke, his voice deep without anger, as he shifted his chair. "Sit down." The plastic chair creaked as the officer lowered himself. He did not lift his eyes, staring instead at the yellow stain on the wall, as if trying to find the last place to hold on to. His breath came short, his chin quivering, the veins along his neck standing out in the harsh white that lit every crease in his skin. The man across opened the file, his finger resting on the first report. The printed paper was brittle, the corner creased with 3 evidence addenda pinned to it. Complaint record, witness statements, video recording. In the footage you said exactly, "You have no right to drive a luxury car here. You black people never learned to bow your heads. Do you deny saying this?" The air grew thick. The older officer pressed his lips together, a bead of sweat slipping from his temple down to the line of his jaw. The smell of dry paper, faint metal, and old plastic from the chairs blended into something bitter that caught in his throat. His voice rasped like a broken sigh. "I said it, but I didn't think." "Didn't think what?" the man asked, his voice low but firm as a shield. Didn't think it would turn into something this big. The officer shook his head, his hand trembling so badly the cap almost fell off the edge of the table. Under the white light, his eyes drifted, pupils shrinking as if to avoid the camera recording every second. The man turned another page, his voice steady. Do you understand why you were summoned for immediate review? Aye. His throat was dry, his words drained of all weight. I just wanted to keep order. His breath caught in ragged bursts. The cold glow caught every deep line around his eyes. Another drop of sweat trailed down his cheek, stopping in the crease of his clenched mouth. A young investigator stepped from the wall, setting down another stack of fresh reports. Among them were old files Elias had turned through on long nights, complaints faded from years in storage, and a photograph of a purple bruise on a mechanic's shoulder, Elias's father. No one spoke, no one shifted. Only the rustle of paper sounded, like dry skin being rubbed raw. The officer bowed his head all the way, shoulders sagging, his chin almost touching his chest. One rough breath slipped out, then went silent. He whispered, so faint it hardly counted as speech. I didn't want to hate anyone. The man across set his pen on the file's edge, voice dropping but staying sure. You were used to believing you were entitled to despise others, not because of duty, but because you thought their skin color made you superior. The words were flat, needing no volume to strike at whatever pride was left. Under the hard white glow, the officer gave a small nod. His breath shuddered up, his eyelids closing slowly. For a long minute, no one moved. Only the small camera on the wall kept blinking, recording every motion, every shallow breath, every weak defense dissolving into the air as cold as a sealed vault. The young investigator looked to the man leading the session, his voice strained. Is everything clear? Everything is clear. The pen dropped to the table, the soft click like the last nail hammered into a door. The man lifted his face, his tone final. Based on the evidence, the conduct of public insult, abuse of authority, and explicit racial discrimination, the disciplinary board rules. Indefinite suspension, no eligibility for reinstatement, case file to be transferred to the prosecutor's office for civil rights violation. The older officer exhaled, his hand falling from the cap. The worn brim struck the table with a dry sound, heavy as the sentence that had waited so long. No one said anything more. Under the merciless white lights, his career broke apart into dust that would never be gathered back. And in that same moment, Alias, standing behind the one-way's glass, knew justice had never been easy, but it had begun here. Midday sunlight crawled through the narrow window slats, falling across the stained tile floor of the third-floor hall where the press conference had been hastily arranged, like an obligatory gesture after a night that cracked every layer of false polish. The chairs were lined in neat rows, the tables draped in old white cloths, a microphone bearing the internal affairs insignia blinking red to record every word. The air was stretched tight, like water on the brink of spilling. In the front row, several reporters clutched thick notepads and pens, their faces marked more by wariness than curiosity. Everyone had seen the video. Everyone knew this image would not fade into the dark, the way hundreds of other incidents had been buried. In the back row, two social behavior experts sat observing, a silver-habled man and a thin woman in glasses. They watched in silence as the screen replayed last night's clip with no sound. In the footage, Elias stood on the steps, shoulders straight, gaze unflinching, the pale gray coat lifting slightly in the cold end-of-night wind. Every time the internal affairs badge flashed under the lights, the room went still. That silence carried something heavier than all the excuses offered for decades. A tall, gaunt reporter stepped out of the front row. His voice rasped from staying awake. Dr. Caldwell, from your research perspective, was this an overreaction or just a flare of anger? The silver-haired man looked away from the screen, folding his hands. He didn't raise his tone to sound important. He just spoke, voice dry but never cold. Racism is never harmless. Whether it comes as a single sentence or a spit on the ground, it carries the same machinery that strips dignity away. Any reaction to reclaim it is not excessive. It is inevitable. Heads in the front row drop, pens scratching the paper in uneven bursts, blending with the soft whir of the ceiling fan. The midday sun and the dusty smell of old paper rose around every collar, a humid reminder that no one here had the right to call themselves uninvolved. The woman in glasses pushed her frames up her nose, her low voice carrying across the room. Collective complicity begins with small actions left unchallenged. One insult, no colleague stops. One look away because it is easier. Over time, it becomes a habit. A community that convinces itself it can turn its back and still say, "That isn't my problem." Some reporters lowered their eyes. A young man laced his fingers, eyelids swollen from lack of sleep. In the angled light, you could see the unease spreading across faces that once believed they were only neutral messengers. When complicity becomes the culture, she continued, voice steady and sure, false power swells like a bubble, and it only takes one pinprick of public scrutiny to collapse it. A long sigh drifted near the windows. The breeze slipped in, carrying midday heat, the scent of shredded paper, and cold coffee from the service desk. Elias stood against the wall, hands clasped, gaze fixed on the screen. Inside, there was no tangle of old files, no surge of anger in his throat, only a steady calm, harder than any fury. A short-haired reporter slowly rose, voice trembling. "Mr. Carter, after everything, do you think you were too harsh?" Elias dipped his chin once, eyes moving across the sun-filled room. He looked at the unfamiliar faces, each waiting for him to soften or retract some part of what he had done, but he felt no need to explain further. The wind pressed hot dust against his jaw, reminding him that courage had never been the same thing as comfort. "Harsh," Elias said quietly, voice rough after the long night, was never about punishment. It was knowing an apology would never restore dignity. Another microphone was lifted from the first row. A young woman's voice rose, edged with urgency. "Aren't you afraid other colleagues will turn their backs on you?" Elias turned to her. For a moment, the sun fell across half his face, highlighting every weary line below his eyes, but never dimming the calm in his gaze. "I don't ask them to stand with me," he answered, voice low but unwavering. "But I won't let silence smother the voice of self-respect. It is stronger than any badge." A new gust lifted the edge of his coat. Someone started a recorder, the click small but sharp as glass tapping stone. Faces tilted in the shifting light, caught between curiosity, respect, and a quiet fear they could not yet name. On the screen at the back of the room, the video faded into a still image. In it, Elias stood on the station steps, shoulders unbowed, hands at his sides, his face set as stone. Behind him, the night sky had faded into a pale band above the patrol cars, now drained of their old power. A voice called out from the back of the hall. No one was sure whose. "One day they'll understand." Elias did not reply. In his chest, a kind of silence rose, warmer than any triumph. It reminded him that no one else would lift justice to its feet if he did not do it first. Early afternoon sun fell over the square in front of the investigative headquarters, harsh light glinting off the windshields of the reporters' cars still parked there. The dark pavement shimmered with heat rising from the steps, casting long, blurred shadows of everyone passing. There was no more noisy commotion like in the morning, but the air held a silent tension, as if the whole city waited for a sign to believe this would not be forgotten. Online, the short clip had traveled farther than anyone planned. 42 seconds of video showed Elias standing still between two rows of patrol cars, the internal affairs badge lowering slowly in his hand, his gaze never leaving the officer with bowed shoulders. That was all, but tens of thousands had shared it as living proof, the thing they had wished for years someone would dare to do on their behalf. The late evening news aired a summary report, the anchor's steady voice trembling around the edges of every word. The recording last night has been called a symbol by many, not because it exposed an individual, but because it put a question before us that no one can avoid. Where does justice live if no one is willing to defend it? Elias sat on a long bench in the second-floor hall, his back against the glass shining with afternoon sun. Footsteps in the corridor sounded more scattered now, no longer rushed. Some officers passed by and looked at him, their eyes a mix of caution, confusion, and a quiet respect no one dared to speak aloud. He did not look away or greet them. Joe. Perhaps everyone knew this was the natural aftershock, the echo that remains after the curtain has been torn down. A young clerk with an armful of files stopped beside beside the bench. He bowed his head slightly and spoke, his voice thin with tension. "Mr. Carter, the Conduct Review Office has opened 4 more investigations. They said many old records will be pulled out again." Elias raised his eyes, meeting the clerk's uneasy stare. In that brief moment, he saw something more than fear in them, a faint relief, the feeling that someone had finally done what he could not start. He nodded once, voice low but steady. "Let them proceed. This is the time no one gets to look away." The clerk swallowed, tightened his grip on the files to stop the shaking, then left without another word. The sound of his shoes tapped lightly on the floor, fading step by step. Elias leaned deeper into the glass, sunlight flooding the hall, shining across the notices on the bulletin board, revealing the signatures of the division heads who only ever appeared when the public demanded reassurance. Outside, clusters of reporters still waited, some just watching the building as if to be sure nothing would disappear before they finished their stories. A group of young men in gray jackets held their phones, pointing toward the steps where Elias had stood the night before. One said, quietly, his voice clear as chalk on pavement, "If he hadn't done that, a dozen people would still think it was just rumors." Another nodded, his eyes sharpening into a small, persistent resolve. They might not know the details of the disciplinary procedure or the rules of legal procedure, but everyone recognized something had cracked, and no apology could seal it shut. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, and in his mind appeared his father's face from years ago. That night, the smell of oil, the eyes that never hoped, only accepted that justice would never come in time. A long exhale left his chest dry and heavy. The breath carried both fatigue and a calm as solid as stone. An older officer walked by, paused just a second to look at Elias. He said nothing, only lifted a hand slowly to touch the badge pinned near his buttons. In that moment, Elias saw a faint nod, an unspoken sign that some had begun to believe change was real. The phone rang over and over in the conduct office. The half-closed door shivered each time someone came out, arms loaded with files pulled from dusty drawers. Every face appearing in that doorway looked tense, but no longer carried the quiet arrogance of the day before. Elias stood, walking slowly along the hall. The slanting sun painted a long shadow next to each step. No one called him back, no one blocked his path. Every footfall struck the floor clear as an old lock clicking shut, marking a chapter closed that no one would pretend never opened. A young reporter crossed in front of him, microphone raised, voice urgent. "Mr. Carter, do you believe this will be enough to force the whole system to change?" Elias stopped, his eyes steady on the earnest young face. He did not frown or look superior. He simply exhaled and spoke each word carefully, hoarse but unbroken. "I don't believe one night can change everything, but I believe if no one plants the first seed, no season will ever come." The reporter lowered the microphone, her hand trembling slightly. Behind her, a few others went silent, some lowering their eyes, some watching Elias for a long moment without saying a word. The late sun softened over the steps of headquarters. Dust rose quietly, settling on the edges of his shoes, cold but no longer heavy as when he stepped from the patrol car the night before. A light wind stirred, shifting the hem of his coat, making the badge inside his pocket tilt and tap lightly against his chest. Elias looked down, then up into the pale blue sky. In his mind, the thought came slowly and clearly. Justice is never waiting for you. It is built from quiet voices and all the mornings when no one believed anyone would stand up first. He walked down the steps, his shadow stretching across the dusty yard. There was no applause, no chant of praise, only the eyes of those still unsure which side they stood on. And in that moment, Elias understood it was exactly those eyes that were the first seeds one brave night had managed to plant. The afternoon drifted slowly over the concrete courtyard, dusted with pale sunlight, a space usually reserved for weary patrol cars returning from long shifts. But today that place had become a marker of a story many were reluctant to admit they had been part of. Across the faded tiles, figures stood in a long line, reporters, witnesses, and a few court officers, quietly watching the final moment before the door of an ending closed for good. Elias stood by the second-floor railing, his hands resting at his sides, his breathing even but not entirely easy. From there, he could see the older officer bowing low at the steps, broad shoulders caved in like an old door frame hollowed out by rot. The wrinkled uniform was dusted with pale sparkles, the sunlight catching every crease that had failed to stay hidden. A court official in a dark shirt stepped forward, holding a thick file, his voice flat as he read aloud, "You are charged with criminal conduct for abuse of authority and acts that humiliated a citizen. The order of remand takes effect immediately." The words echoed off the walls, their steady rhythm as cold as any verdict. The officer did not react, his eyelids drooping, the last trace of arrogance washed from his face. In that moment, he looked no different from any man who had finally run out of excuses. Elias braced a palm on the railing, his fingertip brushing chipped paint. A bead of sweat slipped from his temple to his chin, soaking into the fine dust that had clung there since morning. He drew a long breath, the smell of exhaust and metal filling his lungs. Not pleasant, but never quite foreign. Maybe justice always had that bitter taste, the kind you never get used to, no matter how often you swallow it. A reporter slowly raised a camera. In the frame, Elias was only the witness, the lone figure who never looked away from the bowed head. The lens swept in close, capturing the vacant stare that appeared when a man realized every escape had closed. For a heartbeat, the courtyard went silent. No one dared move. No one had the will left to defend anyone anymore. The officer's breath trembled, his chin quivering. He lowered his eyes, as if smothering any last attempt to speak. The court official drew out the metal cuffs. The click of the lock rang across the lot, dry as a brittle branch snapping. In that moment, a career of decades crumbled into dust that could never be gathered. Elias kept watching. Deep inside, he felt no triumph. What he felt was a cold steadiness, the calm of someone who had done what was necessary, though nothing would ever return the years his father had been pushed to the bottom. A young reporter by the broadcast van raised a microphone, voice quivering. "Mr. Carter, do you think you have won today?" Elias lowered his gaze to the gray tiles, where sunlight hovered over drifting dust. He did not smile, did not pretend pride. He only exhaled, his voice low as a breeze moving through a half-shut window. I don't think this is about winning or losing. This is the moment truth stepped forward, and no one could pretend not to see it anymore. An older man in a suit stood at the foot of the steps, lowering his microphone, his eyes complicated. In his look, Elias saw the fatigue of people who once believed everything would be buried. But he also saw something else, fragile as a new sprout, growing into an awareness no one could turn back from. The evening wind blew through, tugging the small flag above the building's arch. A shaft of sunlight fell straight across, showing every deep line in the face of the officer being led away. In that final glance, he no longer hid the total defeat, not for losing a title, but for losing the illusion that power was ever harmless. The broadcast van's screen flickered, showing one last line. No blinking, no sound, but clear enough to dry any throat reading it. "Do you still have the courage to look straight?" Elias swept his eyes across the line of people waiting for a closing word. Then he turned his back, stepping down the stairs. Each step left a mark in the old dust, a quiet message that justice was never free, and it never asked for perfect people, only someone willing to stand still in the storm. The last light of day settled on his shoulders, the hem of his coat lifting in the evening breeze. In his heart, there was nothing left to justify or excuse, only the hard peace of knowing that if it came again, he would still refuse to look away. An older man whispered, voice uncertain whom he spoke, "Someone will remember today. Someone will understand that bowing your head isn't always safe." The afternoon's heat faded, laying a soft gold across the cold steps, and in that moment, no one dared to laugh. Today's story isn't just about an officer abusing his power and a man striking back with a badge of authority. It's proof that real power doesn't come from a badge. It comes from ethics and justice. Elias, the calm black man, didn't need to shout or fight back. With nothing but composure in his internal affairs badge, he made the man who insulted him lower his head. That was a victory of intellect over prejudice, of resolve over arrogance, and a reminder that skin color doesn't define character. Behavior does. But this isn't just one man's story. It's a wake-up call for an entire system. When those in power go unchecked, the people pay the price. But when the victims choose to rise, even in silence, that system has no choice but to change. If this story made you stop and think, share it so others can take something from it too. Thank you for watching, and we promise to keep bringing you the best stories out there. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, inspiring content.